Dawn leached the color from the sky while the yard of Castle Black steamed with the heat of spilled blood. The bones of the night's fight lay strewn in the frost. Dark lumps of men and fur-clad shapes no longer moving, shattered shafts of arrows, broken shields slick with ice. The wooden palisades creaked in the wind. A kettle of pitch hardened black as slate where it had spilled and spread. Ravens hopped and pecked, fat with courage now that the clamor had ended. Jon's hands were raw beneath his gloves. He had loosed until the bowstring cut his fingers through the leather and the quiver ran light. Then he had drawn a sword and gone down into the press, lifting and thrusting, lifting again. Every step he took now felt like a coin paid to the gods of weariness, and he was nearly bankrupt. Still he moved, because moving kept him from thinking too much about the names flickering like dying lamps inside his head. Gren, PYP, dozens of others, and the ones without names at all. He could smell the tang of iron and pitch and scorched hair. The wind scraped along the inner yard like a whetstone. Ghost padded at his side, the white of him gray in early light, muzzle bloody, eyes like banked coals. The direwolf's head swung to the left, then to the right. He huffed once, a low sound, and bristled. Jon followed the line of his snout toward a heap of bodies near the base of the south wall, where the last wildlings had tried to force the postern gate. A fallen shield lay atop the heap like a lid. Ghost was there in 3 strides, nosing, then tugging. Jon pushed the shield aside and the bodies slumped like smashed crates. Something under them exhaled. The sound was thin as spider silk, a frail thread in the cold. Jon dropped to a knee. Beneath a dead then and a boy from the kitchens who had taken up a spear only to be cut down mere paces from his workbench hands. A woman lay on her side, one knee drawn toward her belly, her arm crooked over her head as if she had tried to shelter from hail. Red hair matted to her cheek, a wildling bough still slung across her back. Ygritte, Jon said, but the word came out as a gust of breath, barely formed. Her eyes cracked open, the gray of a winter sea under cloud. She stared at him as if the world had gone unfamiliar in a single night, and perhaps it had. Her face had lost its color but for the crooked smear of blood at the corner of her mouth and the livid bruising beneath her left eye. An arrow had gouged a path under her ribs and lodged somewhere high in her back. The feathers were black with pitch and frozen blood. "Crow," she said, not quite a whisper. "You're alive." His own voice surprised him with the naked stake of relief in it. He looked to Ghost. "Guard," he told the wolf, and Ghost planted himself beside them. Lips peeled back over scarlet teeth at anyone who dared to glance their way. Jon pushed aside the then, heavy as a mound of stone, then lifted the boy from kitchens. The boy's hair was singed to fuzz. He had eyes the color of dust. When Jon set him down, those eyes stared up at the pale morning without seeing. Jon swallowed and slid an arm under Ygritte's shoulders. "Don't," she said, her mouth tightening. A small laugh bubbled up as if she had found something ridiculous and unavoidable in all this. "Don't be soft. I'm taking you to Maester Aemon," he said. "Or the gods. Let's see who will have you first." She coughed, and it hurt him to hear it. "Old man's still got hands then? Good." The bow on her back snagged, and she swore through clenched teeth. Jon loosened the strap and set the bow aside. It was plain yew with antler knocks, hand-rubbed smooth. He had watched those hands string it 100 times in the fast-running rivers of the Frostfangs, watched arrow after arrow leap and take a bird in flight, a hare mid-sprint, a man only when there was no turning aside. All of that came back sharp as breath in cold air. He lifted her. She was lighter than he remembered, or he was stronger, but his arms trembled all the same. Ghost paced with them, head low. They crossed the yard, stepping through the long shadows of the switchback stairs, past men who leaned against the cold stones with their faces hidden in their hands, past men who cased their fingers around cups of hot ale like they were clinging to hearthstones in a flood. No one stopped them. Some saw and pretended not to. Others looked and looked away, uncertain where their duty lay in a world still rearranging itself under their boots. Inside, the rookery smelled of straw and droppings and the high must of old parchment. The maester's chamber was warmer. It always smelled of herbs and a faint, persistent sweetness that no wind ever blew clean. candles guttered in a wall bracket. Sam stood behind Eamon as if he might be a second, wider shadow, face pale, hair stuck to his brow with sweat he had not noticed. The old maester sat up on his pallet, sightless eyes turned toward the door. "Who is it?" he asked, lifting his head like a hound. The corners of his mouth tightened, as if he, too, could taste the iron in the air. "John," Sam said, turning. His eyes widened, darted to the bundle in John's arms. "Seven, save us." "Set her down," Eamon said. They cut away the rough spun and fur with hot knives to keep the fibers from dragging. Ygritte's jaw set until a vein stood up along her neck. John held her hand. He watched the old man's fingers, how sure they were, gentle as moths settling on lamplight, efficient as a butcher making a clean cut. Sam worked without looking up, fetching the boiling water, the long needle, the honey, the strips of linen. They slid the arrowhead free with a controlled pull that made Ygritte's back arch. Her grip crushed John's fingers. He welcomed it. The pain is proof that she was still tied to the world the same way he was. "Lucky," Eamon murmured, voice dry. "A finger width deeper and we'd be holding a dirge instead of a needle." "Luck," Ygritte rasped. "Ed, once the worst had passed and they had bound her. Luck's just when the gods forget your name for a time. Then keep very quiet," John said. "In case they remember." He let them settle her on a straw-stuffed pallet in the corner. When she tried to sit up, the maester pushed her shoulder and she eased back with a snarl that had no true heat in it. "What will you do with me?" she asked John when the others had stepped away. She smelled of smoke and time and blood and the memory of damp caves far from any banner's shadow. "Hang me with the rest? Leave me outside the gate to freeze proper? I've raided your holdings. I've loosed at your brother's." Her chin lifted. "I would again." "You missed," John said before he could stop himself. Her mouth twitched. "Not every time." He couldn't answer that. He turned away to set her bow against the wall. Ghost lay down beside the pallet with a soundless sigh. Ygritte watched the dire wolf with wary amusement, as one might watch an unchained river. Down in the yard, men shouted. The sound carried upward, thin but sharp, then died. John felt it like a pluck on a lute string in his ribs. He wanted to move again, to keep moving. "We'll talk later," he told her. "I have to see." He didn't finish because there was no finish to it. He had to see the lists, the wounded, the dead, the munitions, the state of the South Gate, whether the giants would return at nightfall with trees for rams. He had to see what remained of his brothers, and whether the handful of officers who called themselves officers would pull together now that the shouting had quieted. He had to see the thing he didn't want to turn and face. "Go," Ygritte said. "You won't sit still no matter what I say." He hesitated. "I'll be back. Don't pull your stitches if you try to strangle Sam." "Wouldn't waste the breath," she muttered, but her fingers tightened on the blanket after he had gone, and the line of her mouth softened in a way he had seen only when she thought no one watched. Outside, the day advanced without warming. The wind turned a fraction, coming down off the wall, pure and old. The ice face had new scars from the night's fire pots, glistening puckers where heat had kissed centuries' hard glacial flesh. John climbed the switchback steps and went out onto the top walk where the world opened like a book. The forest to the north crouched in its endless green-black, and beyond it the world curved away under glaring sky. There were no banners out there, not now, only smoke. By mid-morning, Bowen Marsh had roused enough men to count the dead. Letters were set aside to be written, names gathered like hail in bowls. Alistair Thorne had been carried to a storeroom to be sewn. He slept as if in a hard, mean humor, even unconscious. Janos Slint made pronouncements in the shadow of the armory, about order, about discipline, about the necessity of public hangings to assert the peace. He had a way of speaking that let him sound as if he believed his own words even when his eyes measured men like cuts of meat. A few nodded, more shuffled away, others looked to John, then away again. "We need more oil," Bowen Marsh said, seizing John's arm as if he might drag the supply from his sleeve. "We need men sent to the top. We need the ravens ready to Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower. We need the tunnel shored. We need beds for the wounded, and we need someone to tell the men what to do who is not Janos Slint. Jon was cold through his bones, but his mind felt strangely clear. Have Ed oversee the oil. Sam will see to the ravens. Othel Yarwick must inspect the tunnel, no one knows it better. Send Satin and 3 to gather anything usable from the fallen. And food, Bowen. We need food for the men who still stand. What of the wildling woman? Marsh's mouth pinched around the word, as if splinters had lodged in it. She's wounded. Maester Eamon has her. We should confine her. There are cells. She can't stand, Jon said evenly, and Ghost takes poorly to chains. Bowen Marsh did not care for that answer, but he had too many other problems to spend his disapproval. He wheeled away, calling for Ed. By noon, the world had changed again. The earth trembled. The noise rose like a wave. Men craned their necks so quickly that a few fell from stairs and walkways, clattering down in a jumble of limbs and oaths. Jon went to the edge and shaded his eyes. What he saw was movement through the trees like wind, but it was no wind. It was banners and horses, a line of iron riding out of the south and turning in a wheeling arc through the snowy underwood toward the great host beyond the wall. The sound of trumpets ran along with them like a silver spine. Stannis Baratheon's knights crashed into Mance Raider's camp without any of the courtesy of heralds or pauses for talks. The forest boiled with men. The long fires trampled, tents collapsing, the first shock giving way to a confusion that was somehow worse than battle. Jon watched it unfold, unblinking. His fate had become a fire, and this was another log thrown on it. By evening, a king stood in the yard of Castle Black with frost melting on his beard and a red woman at his shoulder whose eyes seemed to take in more than the world readily offered. Lord of Light banners flamed against the dusk with a heat that seemed to burn without consuming. The Night's Watch assembled in what order it could manage. Black cloaks smudged with soot and blood made a ragged line. Jon, squire to nobody and answerable to nearly everyone, stood in that line with his hands steady at his sides. Mance Raider was brought in chains. His shoulders set and head unbowed for all, he had been given a bruise like a plum along his jaw. Tormund Giantsbane came too, his red beard gone pale with ice, eyes full of a mirth that had nothing gentle in it. Men muttered when they saw him, some with fear, some with the memory of songs he had told over stolen wine. "My brother's wall," Stannis said, his voice a rasp of flint. "I find it in poor repair." Maester Eamon stepped forward as if the world stood clear as a bell to him. "Your Grace," he said and bowed as well as frail bones allowed. "You are welcome on this wall. We could not have asked for better timing and would not have known how to phrase it if we had." Jon saw the smallest twitch at the corner of Stannis's mouth, like the ghost of a smile that had died in an old winter and never quite thawed. "We will speak in my chambers," Janos Slint blurted before anyone else could. "I will advise." "Who are you?" Stannis asked, not turning his head. When told, he grunted as if cured of indigestion. "Then be silent, Janos Slint." Janos turned the color of old ham. A couple of men looked suddenly thinner as they tried not to laugh out loud. Tormund gave the smallest snort. "Who among you led last night?" Stannis asked. "Jon Snow did," Sam said. Too quickly, too loudly. The words fell like a stone in a pond, ripples moving outward. Jon glanced at him, then kept his eyes forward. "Then you will tell me how," Stannis said to Jon. "Walk with me." They walked. Stannis' stride took no account of the churn of the day, or the ache of men who needed rest. He asked questions like a smith testing iron for impurities. Direct, unadorned, insistent. When Jon finished, the king looked back toward the yard where Mance and Tormund stood ringed by watchmen and Queen's men alike, both sides watching the other with tight mouths. "You will be Lord Commander soon enough by the sound of it," Stannis said, matter of fact, as if naming a weather. "Unless your brothers are bigger fools than they look. I will need a man at the wall who understands what must be done, and will do it regardless of who clutches his pearls." "I am a bastard," Jon said, almost reflex, "and there are older men with more years in the watch." Stannis made a noise like a crossbow's trigger. "I know a bastard's work when I hear it." Often better done than a trueborn's and unthanked. Look there. He jerked his chin toward the prisoners. That one, Raider, will bend the knee or he will burn. The free folk will be given a choice. Die or pass through the wall as allies and pay the price I name. You will aid me in making this plain. They will not bend, Jon said. They left kneeling behind a long time ago. That would be why the other choice leaves less room for argument. Jon felt a heat rise in his chest that had nothing to do with torches. Your Grace. Speak, Stannis said, impatient. They are the only bulwark you will find between us and the true enemy. Mance may be stubborn and Tormund worse, but they did not bring that many people south for the joy of our stews. They ran from something. We should not burn what we may need. Stannis's eyes moved to Melisandre. The red woman's face held a calm that was not peace. She looked at Jon with a curiosity that prickled his skin, as if he'd been seen by something colder than ice. The boy speaks as flame speaks when it bends in a high wind, she said in a voice like wine poured over coals. He wants to burn and to hold fast both. Stannis snorted. Fire and politics, Lady Melisandre. They make men silly. We will speak again, Snow. Jon left the king and the red woman there with their quiet that was not quiet at all, and returned to the rookery. Ygritte slept in a shallow, suspicious way, as if rest were a trick. Her breathing was checked but even. Ghost lay with his head across her ankles, snoring softly, fangs peeking. Sam sat with a book slumped in his lap and the mismatched candle glow making the shadows on his face look larger than the face. When Jon eased onto a stool, Sam started. He's still surprised I come back, Jon thought, though I always do unless something stops me. She asked for you, Sam said, and for ale. I gave her water. His mouth tilted, apologetic and pleased both. Maester Aemon says she'll live if she doesn't prove stubborn in the wrong ways. She's the free folk, Jon murmured. Stubborn's what they breathe. Ygritte's eyes opened. You've a sharp tongue for a crow, she said. Her gaze flicked toward Sam. And for a frightened boy who thinks books are a kind of armor. Sam made a small sound. They are a little, he said before he could stop himself. Armor goes over soft places. She considered that and then let it pass, which was her way of yielding in a discussion without admitting it. Your king came, she said to Jon. You smell of horse and arrogance. Will he hang Mance or light a fire under him? Both if he can. But if I can keep it from the fire, I will. Ygritte made a face. You look at him like he's whether you could learn to like. But you're not a kneeler inside, not all the way. I know that about you. Her hand traced nothing on the blanket. He'll want me dead to make his men feel tall. Maester Aemon says you'll live. He's not king. Stannis needs men. He can't kill what could fight for him. He can, and he will if the red which hums in his ear while he counts his swords. Ygritte's eyes slit as if she felt heat. She looks at me like a wet log, reckons I won't catch. But you know fire. You've got that in you whether you want it or no. Her mouth twitched, hurt and wry together. Don't play at being made of snow. Snow melts. He wanted to touch her hair and tell her a dozen small foolish things. Instead, he asked, when you ran from the north, what did you see? Not rumor. You. Her brow tightened at the memories that moved under it, then smoothed as she chose which not to show him. White. That's stupid, you'll say. It's always white beyond the wall. But I mean the kind of white that feels like a knife blade slipped under your nail and up and up. We thought we were clever, hiding in ravines, hugging the rocks. The wind found us anyway. The dead move silent, but the things that lead them make a noise inside your teeth. We had a man tangling with one on a frozen creek. He was quick as a hare, had a knife of frozen glass. He slid that knife into our man as if the air itself wanted it so. Then the man was ours, then not ours. I won't make a song of it. You want more? You've got your own eyes. Take them north and use them. I will, Jon said. She breathed out, and some of the strain left her face. I know you will. That's why I don't hate you so proper as I should. In the morning, Stannis held court in the hall thrown together from 2 storerooms and a courtyard and the bits of dignity left over from better days. There was no place for rich tapestries or gold cups. Instead, there were lists and ledgers and a queen's men's prayer murmurs under their breath, and a line of men waiting to be judged, wildlings with their hands bound, men of the watch with faces set. Tormund met Jon's gaze across the hall and grinned as if they shared a joke about a bear they had both escaped with only a few scratches. On the 3rd day after Stannis came, they brought Mance to a stake. Melisandre's men had built it in the yard where the wind could play through the flames. It dawned on Jon with a hollow little click that this was chosen for the spectacle as much as the heat. The watch assembled again, some with relief on their faces at seeing justice shaped like punishment, some with doubt, some with hunger for something decided. The free folk gathered too, flanked by soldiers, eyes kept down by the fear they refused to show. Jon walked up to the Red Woman before she could loose the first word. "If you burn the king beyond the wall," he said flatly, "you will burn every bridge we might have built with these people." "If?" she asked. "You speak as if the fire pauses for your say." "You like to talk of true kings," Jon said, not bothering to keep his voice from carrying. "Mance was a king to them. He brought them here out of the cold. If you burn him, you tell them there is nothing here for them but pyres. You'll drive them back north, into what waits there. Perhaps the Lord of Light will take him in mercy and show the others an end to fear," Melisandre said. Her voice slid over the yard like oil on water. "And perhaps they'll learn a different lesson," Jon said. He turned his head. "Tormund Giantsbane, tell them what you see when you look north." Tormund shifted the chains on his wrists and stood taller. Men turned because Tormund always drew eyes. His laugh had that trick even shackled. "I see a world that wants us dead," he said, simple and unadorned. "And I see that we crossed every river for the chance to live. If you cut the head off the one who made the chance, we'll make a new chance for ourselves over your corpses. Maybe it'll be a fool's chance. We're good at those." He scratched his cheek with the edge of his fetters. "But this I swear by whatever gods still listen to a man with a false name and the truth on his tongue. You let Mance speak, and he'll make more live out of us being alive than you'll make burning him. That's the trade. We know trades as well as you." Murmurs rolled. Stannis's attention, which had seemed impassive, sharpened. He looked to Jon, who held the gaze like a shield. "The man refused my terms," Stannis said finally. "He would not bend." "Let him bend to the living," Jon said. "Not to your throne. Let him tell his people to pass the gate, to lay down weapons, to pay the price you require. Make him answerable for their behavior. Keep his life as surety." He heard the quick intake of breath beside him and knew before he looked that it was Melisandre. "And let me be responsible for him. If he fails, my head to follow his." "And you think the free folk will call this mercy and not cowardice?" Stannis asked. "They'll call it living," Jon said. "Make it costly. They'll pay. That's what this is. A trade." Stannis's jaw set. "Very well," he said. The word hit the yard the way a sword hits a block. "Raider lives for now. His life is a debt. If he cannot pay with his service to the living, the fire will have him. Untie him." He turned to Melisandre. "You will not set that one alight until I say." She looked at Jon as if measuring whether he cast a shadow deeper than most. Her lips moved and perhaps a prayer slid loose, but she stepped back and inclined her head. The first bridge did not fall into the river the moment it was set. Men argued over every crossbeam. The free folk moved through the gate in ragged clumps. Faces turned to the wooden tunnel like men entering a throat. They handed over axes with reluctance, looked at the wall as at a thing that had grown from the bones of their enemies and would gladly eat them. Children walked stunned, eyes too large in thin faces. The queen's men counted and counted again with tally sticks. Stannis's household knights watched with a wariness that might, in other places, have been contempt but here had to be caution. None of this sat easy and none of it was simple. Ygritte, bound and swearing, was dragged before a board of officers for judgment on the 4th day. Jon stood beside her. That she stood at all was already a victory. She swayed once and set her jaw again hard enough to press blood into her lips. "You're to be held as a prisoner of war," Bowen Marsh said, the words formal in his mouth. "By right, we might hang you for the deaths of brothers of the Watch. But under the king's truce—" "Lots of words," Ygritte said. "A wolf chews less before he swallows." "Under the king's truce," Marsh repeated colder. "The free folk who submit and pay the price will pass the wall. You will not be hanged. You will surrender your weapons. You will be marked and watched. Any breach of the terms—" "Mark me?" She looked delighted. "Put a pretty stamp on my forehead? I like thistles myself." "No stamping," Jon said before Marsh could choke. "You'll keep close to the steward's quarters. You'll carry water, chop wood, do whatever work is set you." Ygritte studied him, then tilted her head. "I see how why. Oh, you talk to your friends," she said. It sounded like an insult and not like one at once. "All right, I'll carry water for your old man with the cloudy eyes. I won't chop wood for the loud one who points as if it's his sword." "Done," Jon said, before the loud one could bristle. He heard Sam's careful little breath behind him and took courage from it. They gave Ygritte a narrow bed in the steward's quarters and a chalk mark on the door that meant what chalk marks always mean to men with lists. "Here is someone to be watched and counted." She resented the mark and then did not mention it again. She fetched water from the cistern while Ghost trotted at her heels with his tongue lolling. She carried bundles of clothing to and from the steaming copper tubs where the filth of the night bled from cloth with a stubbornness that would have impressed a better class of dirt. She split kindling for Eamon's braziers with a neat, vengeful efficiency that left Sam staring in timid admiration. Men watched her go by and said nothing and then said many things when she had gone, because silence is a kind of fear and talking is one kind of boldness that costs least. At night she slept with her back to a wall and her hand under the blanket on a knife she did not have. Jon came to her when he could and did not when he could not. When he came, they spoke about the things that are never in songs. How a man holds an axe in wet gloves, how to tell when water will freeze on rope just by how the rope smells, how many steps it takes to cross a yard when the yard is also an ocean of eyes. "Your brothers think you bewitched me," Jon said one night, amused despite himself. "They don't know you can't cast spells without your bowstring." "Your brothers think lots of things," Ygritte said, rolling onto her back with care and then ignoring that her ribs disagreed. "That burnt man with no jest says he sees a king in Bible smoke. Those other fools count coins to make a line on a stick. You and the old blind bird and your fat friend, you've got the right of it. The rest'll come along like sheep in a river. They pick a rock to stand on and call it a plan." "Bowen Marsh was a good man before all this," Jon said. It surprised him how much he wanted to believe that. Maybe he still is. He's trying to keep the Watch from breaking. "Maybe," Ygritte said. "Wolves bite when you're trying to pet them too. You be careful where you put your hand." He laughed and she smiled, and the smile was small but it was clean. It turned something over in him that he had kept stone flat because staying flat was easier than falling. They worked. The free folk filed through the wall in small floods. Mance was housed in a bare cell with a table and a stool and a guard at the door, and men went in and out of that cell with messages and maps and, increasingly, questions that only someone who had once been one of the Watch and now was not could answer. Stannis kept close count on the debt that was Mance's life. The Queen's men knelt and rose with their prayers, and the Red Woman watched Flame and men both as if both would tell her the thing she wanted before she had to ask. Letters came from Eastwatch. Letters came from the Shadow Tower. Cotter Pike wrote that the sea gnawed at the ice like a tired dog that would keep gnawing until the bone cracked. Dennis Mallister wrote in elegant hand about honor and prudence and the danger of the Watch becoming a seal on Stannis's documents instead of a brotherhood answering to itself and the realm. The Queen and the Princess arrived in a cold blaze of ceremony. Celis with her mouth like a shut door, Shireen with her head full of songs and stories and the kind of quiet sadness that made her a friend to every lonely thing. Ygritte stared at them as one might stare at creatures from a tale, and then snorted once like a mare considering a harness. "Princess or no," she said later, watching Shireen teach a wildling child to trace letters in soot on a slate. "That little bird knows what it is to be shoved aside at a feast. I'd give her a good bone to gnaw if I had one. You have won, Jon said. Your opinion. Ygritte side-eyed him. You're full of clever for a crow. I've been living near Sam. Worse habits to catch, she said, not unkind. The Night's Watchmen gathered in the common hall and argued about who should lead. Janos Slynt declared himself ready to serve, which made Ed cough into his hand as if he had swallowed a wrong wind. Alliser Thorne nursed his wound and his grievance and built his case like a ladder from other men's anger. Othel Yarwick called for steadiness and got the kind of bored respect given to a man who knows where the slots stand for the beams. It went on, and the days thickened, and winter crawled down the spine of the world another finger width. You should stand, Sam said to Jon one night, earnest to his bones. You should. You think about people before you think about yourself, and you listen, and you hate the right things. That last part might matter more than you think, Jon said dryly. He shook his head. I've been told I'm likely. That is not the same as being ready. You'll never be ready, Sam said. That's a lie men tell one another to keep from having to move. I'm a bastard, Jon said, because saying it felt like touching his own scar, the familiar ache. There will be men who will not vote for me for that alone. Then there are men who prefer the wrong reasons to the right man, Sam said, surprising himself and Jon both with the firmness there. He pushed on. Let them be wrong. Be right anyway. Jon made himself smile. When did you become a man with a sword in his mouth? When someone needed to hand you a blade you know how to use, Sam said softly. Say yes. We need you. Ghost's tail thumped under the bench. Ygritte poked the fire with a stick and didn't look up. You're good at throwing yourself at things, she said. Try this one. If it breaks, why? Our head. At least it's your fellows doing it and not a tree. Jon looked at the fire, at how the wood surrendered slowly and then all at once. All right, he said. All right. They voted under smoky rafters with the wind scratching at the shutters. Men whispered in corners. Deals were made, broken, remade, broken again. Stannis watched with one eyebrow twitched upward in distaste, as if the mess of self-government offended him more than the blood on the yard had. When the tally sticks were counted 3 days later and the candles guttered, and it was announced that Jon Snow had been chosen, a sound moved through the hall that was not quite relief and not quite surprise and had a little fear in it and a little hope, because fear and hope too often share a thin wall. Lord Commander, Ed said, and tipped an imaginary hat. Same old Jon, different chair. Same old chair, Jon said. Different splinters. Bowen Marsh's mouth thinned further. Alliser Thorne clapped once, slowly, as if he might choose a better timing if he had his way with time as well as men. Janos Slynt went off and made a long speech to a wall, and the wall did not applaud. Jon slept poorly that night, not because the bed was worse than usual or better. He slept poorly because when he closed his eyes he saw the wall at night at the lip of the world, and the long line of people still on the wrong side of it, and a shadow moving through trees that were only shadows until they weren't. He dreamed he stood under the wall and the ice was a cathedral roof over his head and something tapped its way down the stones to where he stood. Tap, 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 polite as a guest. When he woke, the sound remained. Someone was throwing a pebble at his shutter. He rose and opened it. Cold bit hard. Ygritte stood below, her cloak thrown over her shift. Red hair only a darker stain in the night. She looked up as if the sight of him were something she had made happen by will alone. You've a man waiting for you, she said, voice carrying without a shout. One of those ones from the sea. He smells of salt and old rope. Says hard home. Cotter Pike's letter proved terse and ugly. The words hunched on the page like men around a poor fire. Hardhome was a hungry mouth full of the free folk who had run from one death to risk another, waiting for boats that could not load fast enough and would not come more if frozen seas had their say. Dead things walked beneath the cliffs. Something burned with a smoky fire that did not eat wood but would not go out. Eastwatch can spare 2 cogs and a galley. Pike scratch red, barely paper and half patience. But the winds turned contrarian and the ice is moving in. If we don't come now, we don't come. Send men if you've got men not already digging their own graves. Jon felt the decision arrive in him with a kind of grim gentleness. He did not have men or not enough. He had Stannis's knights, who rolled their eyes at rowing and would rather break lances on a snowdrift than admit to being sick on a deck. He had free folk by the hundreds who would follow Tormund and Mance into the night if he said the right words into their blood and fear. He had Ygritte, who could make a mother with 3 children decide to risk a rope ladder over cliffs if the alternative was waiting to watch her baby's breath dwindle into frost. "I'm going," he said into the room that held Sam and Ed and Othel and Bowen Marsh's disapproval like a colder breeze and Melisandre's silence like a third fire. "I'm not asking. I'm telling. I am Lord Commander and I say so. An outreach to these people risks," Marsh began. "It risks them dying less," Jon said. "Risk that with me or stand aside." Marsh stood aside. He never forgave that. Hardhome was a cliff smell and gull cry in Jon's memory from a time he had never had, and when they came near by sea, it turned out to be only that but colder and crowded with the kind of desperation that makes the air itself taut. The cogs creaked under the load of humanity they took on. Tormund shouted until his voice broke and then shouted more. Ygritte moved through the press like a wind that knows where it's going and will take you along or leave you standing where standing would kill you. Jon's arms ached from hauling, from pushing, from catching, from saying go now, now, now. Ghost stood at the gangplank and snarled at men who hesitated and looked at children with a softness that made the children move where snarling had not. The dead came down out of the trees at dusk on the second day. They came so quietly that only Ghost heard them at first, and then everyone did because the quiet turned into a silence that reached into the mouth and pinched shut the tongue. The free folk stood with the Night's Watch shoulder to shoulder with Queen's men, who had never imagined a day when they'd thank a spear wife for finding them a thicker rope. They could not kill what was already gone. They could only break them and break them again and push the pieces into the sea and hope the sea had more hunger than the other thing. The hard white ones, those like carved ice that moved with a grace too elegant to be kind, hung back and watched until they did not. One stepped forward on the crest of a broken stair and the air around him turned thin as heights. Jon moved without thinking about wanting to live. He raised Longclaw and felt the old friend weight settle into the honest line from wrist to elbow. The thing moved too quick and too quiet, and his blade met it and sang the way steel sings when it finds what it was made to strike. The white took the blow and came apart like glass struck with a hammer, and cold smoke went up and the cold went deeper for a moment and then not. Ygritte's arrows had long since found their homes in eye sockets and throats and buds of brain where skulls had cracked like the shells of rotten eggs. Now she took down a white thing's servant with a shot that had to go between 2 men's DS moving in different panic and did. Tormund roared a laugh that shook a plank loose and then used that plank to beat 3 dead men off a ladder. There was no song there, not even in Tormund's mouth. There were just minutes that each held more heartbeats than they should have. They held the line to the boats. They made a harbor out of 3 men and a rope and the stubbornness of mothers. When at last the wind turned a degree and the ice shifted in a way that meant go now or die more slowly with better excuses, they went. The sea took what it took on the way back. The dead watched them from the cliffs with the patience of cliffs, and one of them lifted a hand in a slow, precise motion that made Jon's stomach drop through him. Something on the far shore answered with a flicker of pale fire. The ships came in low and tired. Eastwatch took what they brought and then more and then too much. The yard at Castle Black filled again with faces that did not believe in rest. Mance's cell door stood open so often he might as well have held court in the hallway. "You did what I would have," Mance said to Jon, not smiling, not smiling. "You did it as well as it could be done, which is not to say good enough for the story you'd want to tell. That's how the best stories go." "The dead don't care about stories," Jon said. "No," Mance agreed, "but the living do, and they're the ones we need to make move. You saw them move. You know how. Keep doing it." Bowen Marsh gathered men like a man gathers apples he believes are bruised. He spoke in corners and on stairs and outside doors where a draft could carry his words back to him, so he could say he'd never said them like that. Alistair Thorne watched and said little. Janos Slint puffed himself up and walked about and did less harm than he might have because talking made him feel as if he had acted. Jon knew they were speaking. He did not know when it would come, and that's what made him sleep even lighter than the wind on the wall. Ygritte slept on with a knife she did not have under her hand and woke the instant He lifted a breath quicker than the one before. Ghost slept like snow with a temper. Winter took another step south. Stannis took his army toward Winterfell because he could not exist in a place where movement was not happening in the direction of thrones. Celis stayed, to remind the Watch of gratitude. Shireen stayed too because a child is a flag no one knows what to do with unless they are cruel or kind, and there were more men in Castle Black now who leaned toward kind simply to have a counterweight. Melisandre watched the fire, and sometimes the fire watched back with a shape in it she tried to befriend with names. She spoke to Jon less about kings and more about words like purpose, and he did not like those words, but he did not throw them away because he did not throw away anything that might, in a lean month, be used as fuel. It happened at night because men like night for dirty work out of some half-wit notion that darkness makes your guilt a cloak you can hang in a wardrobe come morning. It happened not in Jon's chamber, because he had kept a promise to himself and to Ygritte and to Sam never to make himself easy to find at night, but by the granary where wildlings and watchmen alike waited for a ration of ground oats. Men stood in the thin line shape of a queue that fear makes. Men muttered. A knife dropped and clinked, and someone said curse that in a way that made three others look too quickly. Bowen Marsh stepped out of the shadow of a cart, and his face was so white that if he had fallen, the snow might have refused to take him for fear of being made less pure. "For they," he said, and then stopped because he had sworn something to himself and he was about to break it all at once. "For our oath," he said instead, low and urgent and choked. "You've broken it. You bring enemies through our gate. You make free with the king's favor. You risk us all to save those who would not save us if the world were turned." 3 men moved with him, knives shown. One was Aliser's man. One was a conscripted criminal who had found in the Watch a cloak that did not yet fit his shoulders. One was a boy who had seen his father dead in a burned crofter's hut and had not made peace with it. Jon had time to think a single clear thing. "I should have slept with my sword." Then Ghost hurtled. The first blade took Jon where a man's cloak meets his ribs. But the angle was wrong and Ghost's weight bowled the knife man aside so the cut went along and not in. Jon stumbled and caught himself and then did not think. He moved like he had on the stairs with the dead clawing up beneath him, and his hand found the hilt of a cooking knife left in a barrel. It was not long claw, but it was made for cutting and he could cut. The second blade went past him as he turned and took the boy's wrist so neatly that the knife fell and the boy howled. The third blade he did not see in time. Ygritte saw it. Her arrow went in under the man's arm where the ribs meet, quick and without a word, because she had started carrying a bow again by then, with permission or without it, and she had never stopped being who she was. Bowen Marsh froze. Aliser Thorne, who had been watching from 10 paces away, did not. He stepped in and, with a neat, disgusted motion, inserted the point of his knife into the meat of Ghost's shoulder where the fur lies thickest. Ghost yelped and turned, only turned, and his jaws closed on Thorne's forearm. Teeth met. Bones never did like that. Men shouted. More men came running. Some wildlings drew breath to howl and then chose to listen instead of howl because Ygritte lifted her bow again and looked at them the way a winter storm looks at a man who thinks he can judge it. "Stop," Jon said, and blood ran down his side and he ignored it as he had ignored worse. "Stop this now." Marsh's face crumpled. He had planned a hard thing and found it become a messy one, and found himself in a pool he had not wanted to swim. "You are breaking us," he said. Tears glittered on his cheeks like small cruel jewels. "You are breaking us." "I am saving us," Jon said, because it was the truth and because saying it was the only thing that kept the rage in his throat from being a roar. "You tried to kill me." He looked at Thorne, who was turning white in a different way as Ghost worried at him. "You!" His hand tightened on the kitchen knife. He saw Stannis's mouth in his mind, saying very well, and Melisandre's eyes like red coals and Aemon's thin hands and Sam's messy bravery. He saw Ygritte's shoulders the first time she had walked away from him in the snow and the way she had not turned back until the last possible moment. "Aliser Thorne, I name you a traitor to your vows. Bowen Marsh, you plotted murder of your Lord Commander in the yard of this castle while men who have never taken our vows waited for bread. Both of you will be held." Men with pikes moved at his word, and that, more than anything, saved him. They moved because they were used to moving when Jon spoke, and habit is a kind of miracle. They moved because Ygritte stood just behind Jon, and she would have put an arrow through anyone who put a blade at his back before the blade had time to be pleased with itself. They moved because Ghost stood bristling and bloodshot-eyed, and all of them had always secretly wanted to be the sort of man a wolf like that would not despise. They cleared the yard. They bound Thorn's arm with rough bandage and rougher courtesy. They took Bowen Marsh by the elbows as if he were a grandfather who had dropped his cup. The boy with the cut wrist wept in a hiccuping way, and Jon told someone to bind him and get him to Eamon and then send him to the armory to sharpen dull blades for a week and then to sleep. The man Ygritte had shot was dead with his eyes open, and the expression on his face said he had wanted to tell someone that he had changed his mind about this but had not found the words in time. Blood ran down Jon's side in a more convinced trickle. He found suddenly that his legs had become straw. Ygritte's hand was at his elbow, hard and warm. "You'll sit now," she said, "before you fall through your own feet and shame us both." He let her lead him. He sat. His head dropped and then came up again because Ed stood there with a grin like a grimace and said, "You always pick the afternoons with the worst stew to bleed on the floor, my lord." "Didn't want anyone to notice," Jon said, light-headed. "Fat chance," Ed said, and Sam made the kind of noise he always made before he cried and smiled and shouted at once. They mended him. The scar ran along his ribs like a line drawn by a drunk god. It pulled when he laughed and when he bent and when he breathed too much in the cold. He wore it the way he wore other things, with the knowledge that the world never forgot to keep a tally. After that night, men looked at him differently. It wasn't that they had not believed he would die. They had believed. It was that he had not, and that changed something in their eyes that even men like Marsh could not quite move back by speech. Alliser Thorne cursed in a low voice that kept his belly warm and his days long inside the cell. Bowen Marsh put himself in the noose of duty. He had hoped to tighten around Jon's throat and pulled it instead around his own. And Jon did not have mercy or its opposite in him. What he had was a ledger and the habit of balancing it. The winter deepened. Stannis sent raven letters with a cold fury in their scratches that said he had found the Boltons harder to stamp upon than snow and harder to catch than wolves. Melisandre spoke of getting fire where there was none and of king's blood and of a shadow among the Northmen that was not a shadow. Jon listened, and he said no to the pyres when she suggested them in the way men suggest things they think are inevitable. He permitted her 100 candles where he would not give her one body. She watched him for this. Sometimes something like respect flickered under her regard, and sometimes something like calculation. Ygritte moved between the worlds without making a speech about it. She taught wildling children where the safe roofs were on a snow-heavy night, and watchmen that some trees make bad fuel because they spit sparks into your sleeve. She stood with Mance in a room with a single brazier and told him he was not allowed to collect all the dignity in the castle for himself. She would have a share. He hugged her and wept. And in that moment Jon loved him as much as he could love a man he wanted to argue with every hour of the day. They quarreled, Jon and Ygritte, about little things that were not little. The price the free folk should pay for being allowed to live on land they had always walked without asking. Whether vows meant the same thing when the world had become a mouth. Whether to send 3 men or 4 to a village nobody had thought about for 20 years. Whether to move the store of salt to the East Granary. They laughed too, and the laughter built a small house in winter that they could eat their bread in and sleep in sometimes like people who believed morning would come. One morning, the wall spoke. It did not speak in words. It spoke as ice speaks when something presses its hand against it and then presses harder. It sang in a low, painful moan that ran down into men's bones and made their teeth ache. Men came out of doorways holding their cloaks closed with one hand and their old beliefs closed with the other. The sound went on a long minute and then stopped and then started again. Jon went up onto the top walk with Ghost at his side and Ygritte half a step behind him, and the world beyond the wall was not changed, except that it was. The forest crouched and waited. The sky was a clear, killing blue. But out there, on the white plain beyond the last scrub, a line moved. It was a line of nothing. It was a line where the air itself seemed to harden and take on a shape, and the shape had a direction. It advanced a hand's breadth, stopped, advanced again. The men behind Jon made the sounds men make when they want to swear and want to pray and can't decide which is worse. "We've time," Ed said, and then added, "for a while." As if he believed there were a difference. Signal to Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower, Jon said. Then send a raven to Stannis. Send 2. Send 10. And after the writing? Ygritte asked quiet, for him alone. After the hoping and the sending? After that? Jon said, long breath that felt like it might frost his own mouth. We do the thing we've made ourselves for. We hold. Good, she said. You're better at that than most. He took her hand. It was rough and warm and entirely alive. When the line touched the forest, the trees did not burn. They turned quiet. Birds lifted and then fell out of the air as if surprised by the lack of air. A fox ran toward a hole and did not reach it. The dead came with the line because the dead go where the cold tells them. The high white ones came too, moving in a way that made a man's eye hurt to follow. They came on and they were slow and they were patient and they were not tired because they had given that away. Jon looked out at them and saw all the days behind him and all the days ahead and understood something he had not wanted. That every choice had been a bracing for this. He had saved wildlings not because it was kind but because it was necessary to have a people who would not fold the moment the dead put their hands out. He had spared Mance not because mercy was a pleasant word, but because the living needed a story that made living a thing a man could be proud of when he laid down at night with hunger and fear curled against old bones. He had taken knives and kept breathing because breathing was the long game. Open the armories, he said. Bring up the barrels of oil and the baskets of dragonglass. Put longbowmen on the third walk. Ed your men on the scorpions. Sam, send to Eamon and the Queen's men. We'll need every flaming arrow they can conjure. Othel, the tunnel. Lord Commander, Bowen Marsh said, voice small behind him, humble in a way that made it sound honest for the first time in months. What of me? You'll stand with me, Jon said, and he meant it. There are moments when almost everything is forgiven not because mercy comes easy, but because the next breath cannot be spent on old debts. And if we live, we'll argue. Marsh nodded with tears on his face and found his place beside Thorne, who had been fetched from his cell because even traitors can aim and there are hours in a life when you call on every steady hand, no matter whose back it is held a blade for. Ygritte notched an arrow and then another and another. She looked at him and he looked at her, and it was like most of the other times they had looked and like none of them at once. I told you to see with your own eyes, she said. I see you, he said, and then turned to the wall. They held. All day and then the next and then the next after that, in swaying lines and ragged knots of men who feared and stood anyway. The dead broke themselves against iron and ice. The white ones shattered on Valyrian steel and the black glass that men had laughed at as peasant stories 2 years ago. Stannis's ravens brought word that the north was eating itself, but not so swiftly that it would be empty by the time the cold arrived. There would be something to save when the wall bent, and that was a feeling men could use like a stick to keep themselves from falling. The fourth day, a horn sounded from Eastwatch. Ships rounded the headland with sails so stiff with frost they looked like the bones of sails. Cotter Pike stood on the prow of the first with a wild grin and shouted obscenities that made even Tormund blink. They had brought pitch and rope and men with hard hands. They had brought what the living bring one another when they choose to, presents. The fifth day, Stannis's night sergeants arrived out of the south with eyes that said they had stopped believing in their king's wars and started believing in their own feet. They took their places alongside shepherd boys from the Gift and spearwives who had learned to laugh at proclamations. On the sixth day, the line in the north wavered. On the seventh, it cracked and then healed and then cracked again, and the white ones pulled back a dozen paces and stood like a lesson in patience. The dead that had not yet fallen fell still. The world held its breath for long enough that men remembered there were other things to do with air than gulp it. Winter's teeth are in us, Ygritte said that night, her voice low against the stone of the wall, as if she would not give the cold the satisfaction of hearing her speak loudly. But we're still moving our mouths. Tomorrow, Jon said. They'll come tomorrow. They'll come the day after too, she said. And the day after that. That's what the dead do. We'll be doing this until our hair turns white and falls out. Our hair is already white, Ed said, walking past with a coil of rope. In our hearts. Speak for your heart, Sam said, lugging a basket of glass. Mine's been terrified into youth. The moon rose like an old bone. Ghost lay with his head on Ygritte's boots. Mance leaned on the parapet a little distance away and stared north as if he could will the land back into a harder shape. Melisandre watched the little brazier at her feet and the big fire in the night and saw different things in each and said as little as she knew how. "Do you remember the cave?" Ygritte asked, not looking at him. "Yes," he said. "The water sounded like sleep. If we had stayed," she said. "If we had never come out, we would have drowned in the end," he said, soft. She nodded, slow. "I would have liked to drown with you," she said. "Boo. I like this better." He touched her hand in a place where no one was looking. Her fingers curled and uncured. She lifted her chin. "Don't you die," she said with the old wild fury under the words like a hearth coal under ash. "Not until I say. I obey my Lord Commander," he said solemnly. "You obey the one with the bow," she said. "Always have. Don't start being wrong now." They did not sleep. The night was too full of a silence that felt like a choir listening for a cue that never came. The morning broke and the dead moved again, and the living stepped to meet them, and it went on. It felt, sometimes, like standing waist-deep in a river and watching whole countries float by. Faces, places, names, choices. Jon stood in the center of it and gave orders and fired and struck and stepped back when he had to and stepped forward when it was time to do something that would kill him if he hesitated. And he did not hesitate. He did not die. He did not live easily either. On a day when the light made the ice look like the inside of a salt stone, the dead stopped. They stopped and then they went away, not as men go away but as cold withdraws on a day when the sun stands stubborn. The white ones went with them. They left behind the stillness of a battlefield and a silence that could be called peace if a man were drunk or very generous. The men cheered and did not. They wept and did not. They went to their beds and lay down and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. The world had moved and not moved, and it is hard for bone to understand when it must be grateful. Jon stood on the wall and watched the line where the thing that had come now was not. Ygritte leaned on the stone beside him and he felt her shoulder warm at his upper arm through 2 layers of leather. "They've learned something," she said. "So have we." "What did we learn?" he asked, and he did not mean it as a challenge. He meant it as a man asking the wind whether it means to keep blowing. "That we can bleed and stand, that we can hold, that the dead aren't the only ones with patience," she said. "That a crow and a spearwife can make a thing together that holds." He nodded. "We'll have to do it again." "We will," she said. "And again." He looked south. Somewhere beyond the trees and the hills, a man with a flayed man on his banner sharpened a knife and smiled. Somewhere beyond that, a woman with dragons thought of the sea between and the years stacked like chairs between wish and reach. Somewhere beyond that, a queen sat in her high seat and counted debts and called it love. Somewhere beyond even those, a child traced letters in charcoal and made a story from them. Because that is what children do when a world refuses them simpler gifts. The wind lifted. It carried with it a smell of smoke and the old sweetness that came from the maester's herb chest. It carried the iron stink of old blood and the clean slice of new ice and the ghost of the caves where water sounded like sleep. Jon reached for Ygritte's hand. She took it the way a hand takes a sword it knows, and they stood there with the world in front of them and the wall at their backs and the work of holding set like a jaw. "Once we get through this," Ed said behind them, "we'll have the next thing." "That's the curse," Sam said softly. "That's the life," Ygritte said, and tugged Jon's hand once, quick and hard as a promise. Snow fell soft as ash the night after the dead withdrew, and by morning the yards had a bright crust that squeaked under boots. Men walked with their collars up, breath pluming like ghostly banners, and for the first time in days there was laughter unpinned from madness. It was a thin laughter, but it held. Jon went with Ed along the narrower walk above the east granary and counted barrels by tapping lids with his knuckles. He wrote in a ledger with fingers that still pulled when the cold got mean. Ghost moved below them like a pale ship, weaving between stacks of cordwood and sacks of oats. When a stack shifted and a sack split and poured a soft hill onto the packed snow, Ygritte strode in and knotted it shut with the easy competence she had with every simple need. "You look like a man trying to find a song in numbers," she said, tugging the cord with her teeth. Some men sing badly, John said. I count badly, but I do it. You always did like doing what needed doing, even if it made your face long. She handed him the bag. How many days? If we're spare and the Queen's men stop eating like summer's still upon us. 63 at full rations, 90 at lean. He touched the tip of the quill to take off the excess. If fishermen bring us more. If pike keeps the sea lanes open longer. If. Ygritte shivered and then stomped one foot as if to warn the cold off. I'll have Tormund send his best fishers to the long barrow ponds. And there's a lake near the old village you call Oakenshield, frozen near to a finger's depth. Cut a hole, lay line, be patient. The best fish are fools for patience. Talk with Mance, John said. We'll need his word to keep the poaching from becoming a brawl. She snorted. You always think a word is a door. Sometimes it's a latch that sticks because the wood swelled. And sometimes you kick the door, John said mildly. She gave him a look that warmed places his wolfskin did not reach. That too, Crow. He closed the ledger. Come with me. To what? More lists. To a thing I should have done weeks ago and left too long. He slid the book into his belt and started down. The ache at his ribs tugged, but he knew the pain now and it knew him. They found Janos Slint in the common hall, talking to two of the Queen's men with that air he had, as if words were coins and he was doling them out to keep men grateful. He broke off when he saw John and didn't bother to hide the dislike that sat in his mouth like a bad taste. My lord, John said, you will take 30 men to Greyguard by noon Tom. Aro, the outer wall has fallen in 3 places and the inner keeps are full of snow. I want a roof standing and the east tower patched inside a fortnight. Janos blinked. His face went from smug to storyteller's hurt in a heartbeat. Greyguard? That ruin? Don't be absurd. I am a commander of men, not a mudscraper. You are a brother of the Watch, John said evenly. And Greyguard is one of our castles. We swore to hold them. The work needs a man with a voice and a back. I picked yours. The hall listened, spoons stilled. I will not go, Janos said, puffing out his cheeks. Send one-eyed Ed. Send the butcher's son. Send your little lover with her bow. I will not. It's an insult and you know it. Ygritte's head lifted like a wolf that had scented something small and foolish. Ed's eyes flicked to the far end of the hall where men had begun drifting in from the yard. The way flies find a spill of honey. A man can refuse, John said. A brother cannot. He felt his heartbeat tick with that old steady hammer he had learned to trust more than any poem. If you will not go by your feet, you will go bound on a sledge and I will appoint another to do the work you were meant to claim. Janos laughed, but it tripped as it left his lips and fell ugly. You won't dare. A leader ought to carry his own blade when the words need iron. John did not think that thought so much as live it. He reached for Longclaw. The leather for the grip was warm from his body. Snow sifted at the open door behind him, and he heard somewhere very near the quick intake of breath that men make when they smell blood before it's spilled. Ed, John said without looking away from Janos. Fetch me a block. Ed moved, already moving. John raised his voice. Janos Slint refused a lawful order. He spat on his oath. He sets himself above the Watch. I'll have none of it. Bring him. Men seized Janos, more of them than the matter truly required, as if eagerness could count as courage. He fought like a cat bound in rough hands, spitting, promising doom in the mouths of kings. Ygritte watched with her mouth a hard line, eyes hot and not forgiving. Not of Janos. He meant nothing to her, but of the necessity, because she understood necessities all the way down to the bone. They dragged him out into the yard. The sky had a thin blue stretched over it, as if someone had washed it too often. Ed brought a section of seasoned oak. John touched the surface with a bare hand. It was cold enough to sting. He set it down where the ground was packed flat and snow swept clear by boots, and he turned because you had to look at the man when you cut him. That was the cost. Please, Janos gasped at the last. As the men forced his neck down, he had pissed himself. The smell rose sharply. Please, my lord. John did not put his hand on the man's neck. He did not insult him with a touch he did not mean. "I take no joy in this," he said, and the truth set his voice steady. "But I will not have a coward for an example." He lifted Longclaw, and the blade showed him his face in a small, curved flash, and he set the edge where it needed to be and brought it down. It was clean. That was the only gift left to give. The head thumped into snow and painted it. Somewhere behind him, Melisandre's low voice threaded the cold with a language he did not know. Shireen cried out and was hushed quickly by no one's hand. The sound lodged like a burr in Jon's throat. Ygritte did not look away. When he turned, she met his eyes without flinching. "You did what you said you'd do," she said. "There's worse." "There is," he said. His stomach twisted, slow and unpleasant, and then steadied. He wiped Longclaw on clean snow and slid it back into its sheath. When he glanced down, Ghost was there at his side, head cocked, as if asking whether this was the kind of hunt he should learn. Jon scratched him behind the ear. "Not this. Not for you." After, the hall filled with sounds that meant the world had not ended. Bowls clinked, spoons scraped. Men argued about salt. Jon sat with Sam and Ed and Ygritte and forced himself to eat stew. Celis Florent sent a sour-faced messenger to tell him that King Stannis would disapprove of the waste of a man, and Jon sent back word that the watch was not a field where the king sowed and reaped, then returned to his bowl and the work on his table that would not do itself. Melisandre did not bother with messengers. She came herself, a flicker of fire at the corner of his sight, and stood. "You took a life to balance your scales," she said. "I took a life to press down on the side of order, so that the side of chaos would not fly up and spill the grain," Jon said. "Order," she murmured, as if testing the word with her tongue. "Winter has its order. Death is a kind of governance. Be certain whose laws you keep." Ygritte laughed, raw and short. "And be certain you know a winter when you see it," she said. "You talk like fires never burnt you." "It has," Melisandre said, and for the first time since she had come to the wall, her voice held something not like certainty. Tiredness, perhaps, or a memory. "It will again." When she was gone, Sam shifted on the bench and leaned forward, hands around his cup like he meant to warm the world with them. His eyes were red from the smoke and from crying. Sam cried easily and didn't pretend otherwise. "I have to go," he blurted. "If I'm to come back a maester, I have to go." Jon had known this, but knowing a thing and hearing it said in a voice you would miss are brothers, not twins. He nodded. "You'll go with Maester Aemon, and Gilly, and her babe." Sam bit his lip. There's a complication. Celis wants the king's son." "He has no son," Jon said. He set the bowl down, appetite gone. "He has a daughter, and we will not be burning her." "Not him." Sam's voice dropped. "She means Mance's son. The Red Woman says any king's blood will serve the Lord of Light. She says the boy's blood is a coup. Why for doors we cannot open any other way." He swallowed. "Aemon told me the story of Summerhall and the fire that ate a prince and almost a king. He says blood makes for sloppy keys. He says..." Sam wiped his nose on his sleeve, as if he were still a boy with a cold. "He says if there's a place for that child where he is only a baby and not a banner, we should send him there. He asked me to tell you because he can't say it loud enough on his own." Ygritte's mouth had a hard line to it that meant she was thinking around a thing she didn't like. "If you swap him," she said slowly, "you'd be stealing. The free folk don't forget stealing." Jon nodded, heavy. "I know." He pictured Dallas Small, still face as he had seen it only once, lit by a guttering candle, and the child with his fierce, determined mouth. "I will tell Mance. I'll ask. It should be his choice, as much as we can let it be anyone's." "You'll ask?" Ygritte said, and relief slipped into her tone like a warmer current finding a colder one. "Good." Then she frowned. "And if he says no?" "Then I will do it anyway," Jon said, because there wasn't any version of the world in which he would set a child on a pile of wood and ask him to pay the balance in flames. The words tasted like iron. "And I will live with what that makes me. And I will see to the boy until there is a man to watch him who isn't me." Sam looked at his hands. Eamon says sometimes you have to break a law to keep a promise. To what? Jon asked, though he knew. To being human, Sam said. Mance did not make it easy. Jon went to him in the little room that had become a council out of necessity, with a table that wobbled and a brazier that smoked and maps whose edges curled in the heat and the damp. The king beyond the wall sat with his elbows on the table and his hands knit to keep them from doing something unwise. When Jon told him, he closed his eyes. He did not pound the table. He did not shout. His breath moved in and out like the sea, thinking, "Dalla would have cut your eyes out if you'd come at her with this," he said at last, almost gently. "And after, she'd have said you were right." "I am asking," Jon said. "You're telling." Mance looked up. There was nothing in his face that wasn't a man's pain. "I know the truth when it's in the room. You want me to say it so you can feel better about carrying it out. I want you to be part of saving your son. That too." Mance looked to the brazier and back. "I never bent to Stannis. I bent to the north and to the living. I'll bend to this." He swallowed. "You take him, but you take another boy in his place and you keep him safe and you don't let the queen's foolishness burn him either. Gilly loves her babe. She may love another just the same. Some mothers are like that." "Some," Jon said. "Tell her the truth," Mance said. "If you make it lies, it goes wrong in the night." Jon inclined his head. "I will. Tell her I said thank you," Mance said, and anger made the thanks sound like a wound. "Tell her I will owe her any song she wants when the world remembers it can sit by a fire and ask for a tune again." Gilly cried without sound when Jon told her. She held her child and rocked, and the tears slid down her cheeks and caught on the line of her mouth. Then she wiped her face with the edge of her shawl and took the other child into her arms. "I will keep him safe," she said, with a ferocity that lit the dim cell brighter than the candle did. "I will keep them both safe. I will not let the queen's men touch him." Sam watched her with a look on his face that meant he had been given another task and was both proud and terrified to receive it. "I'll see you to Old Town," he said. "I'll learn every chart and every star. I'll stand on deck and throw up and still I'll watch. And when I come back, I won't be afraid of my own shadow." "Don't stop being afraid of wolves," Ygritte said practically. "The big white one won't eat you, but the smaller kind will, given a chance." Sam nodded. "Salam." "Good advice." They did it at dawn 2 days later, because dawn is when you do things that change the shape of your day. Melisandre stood in the yard with her hands hidden in her red sleeves and her eyes half closed. Perhaps she saw, perhaps she only wanted them to wonder whether she did. Celis came out long enough to say that this was an act of mercy to the woman Gilly, since her child would be brought up in a palace of learning and cleansed of his mother's ignorance. Then she went back inside because the wind bit her skin and the queen prefers her discomfort to be of a kind she chooses. They put Gilly and Maester Aemon and Sam onto the Cinnamon Wind, whose crew were as dark as the wood they polished and twice as fine. Salador San did not sail her. He had other fish to fry, but his cousin did, a man with thick wrists and quick eyes who bowed to the blind maester as if he were a prince and swore to keep the children safe with a hand over his heart. Shireen stood on the quay and waved so hard that Jon feared she would pitch into the water. Devon Seaworth steadied her without touching, the way a boy taught to be careful in his father's house learns. "Write to me," Shireen called. "Write to me about everything. Maester Aemon. Tell me about all the great maesters. Sam. Tell me about the university. Gilly. Tell me whether they have honey there." Gilly laughed a little and promised she would, and then the lines were cast off and the ship slid out, and the little cluster on the quay stayed until it was only a darker line against the pale horizon. Melisandre never moved. When Jon turned, she was already gone. "Better when a goodbye takes a boat," Ygritte said. "When it takes feet, you keep hoping and the door keeps opening. Boats make clean lines. They also sink," Ed said. "That's the spirit," Jon told him. Ed looked pleased, as if he'd been complimented on a skill. With Sam gone, the rookery felt larger and quieter. Ravens did not ask fewer questions. They simply asked them of other hands. Satin proved a capable stand-in for what Sam had done, with the same quickness to learn but less willingness to fear. Maester Eamon's pallet remained in the corner with the impression of his frail body in the straw for a week after the ship had sailed, and Jon could not bring himself to send a steward to shake it out. He went there himself one evening at dusk and smoothed the straw and told the dark room, "He will write." And the room accepted his lie as gently as it had accepted the man who had lived in it. Word came from the south as autumn fell into winter as a man falls into a ditch. Stannis had taken Deepwood Motte. Stannis had been bogged in storms. Stannis's supplies were thin. The Karstarks had come to him with smiles and knives in their sleeves. Umber men had howled for him and howled at him. Each raven brought its own flavor of truth, and truth is never cooked to everyone's taste. News came from a longer road too. There were men on the stepstones who swore by their mother's ghosts that a queen across the sea rode with monsters of the air. A peddler fetched up at Eastwatch and cried the tale until Cotter Pike's men hurled him into a snowbank to cool him. Even cooled, the tale got into other mouths. Shireen asked Jon whether he believed in dragons. "Dragons believe in themselves," Jon said, and the answer pleased her far more than it pleased him. Manderly's men sent a letter with too much wax and too many flourishes and not enough simple words. There would be a wedding at Winterfell. Arya Stark would be married to the bastard of Bolton to secure peace for the North. Peace. Jon's stomach turned the way it did when the sea got cute. He took the letter to Mance and watched the Wild King's face as he read. "They mean to sew a Stark skin to that bastard's name," Mance said, tapping the mark with one blunt finger. "They mean for Northerners to call their Leal voice when they say hers." He tossed the letter onto the table where other bad ideas sprawled like tired dogs. "It's a trick. Might be they've found a wolf girl. Might be they found some poor cub who looks like one in bad light. Either way," Jon said, and the ache that lived under his ribs since he'd come out of the south swelled and swelled. "She's not a prize to be traded. She is my sister." "How many sisters do you have suited for stealing?" Ygritte asked. She had come in without them hearing and stood with her hip to the table, red hair unbound. "Because if there are two the same, we could return one after." Jon gave her a look she knew and liked and disliked all at once. She softened, then squared her shoulders. "You want to go south and burn that flayed man's house down around his ears," she said. "I see it on your face. Can't do it. You'll break this wall if you take a step away, and then where will we shout from when the next cold comes?" "I know," Jon said. The word had more iron than surrender in it. "But there's a thing I can do. Mance, will you go?" Mance's laugh had no humor. "As a singer? With a harp? You want me to play for Ramsay Bolton and steal him a bride from under the sheets?" "Not you alone," Jon said. "Spearwives with quick hands. A dozen looks. One chance. Get her out and get yourself out. And when you come north again, I'll owe you more than a song." "I like owing men things," Mance said dryly. "Keeps me alive." He drummed his fingers. "It can be done. I know the ways in and out of Winterfell like a cook knows the pantry. Not because I've slept in their beds, mind you. Because the stones make a shape that doesn't change just because a bastard sits atop them." He looked up. "I'll need their glittering woman to change my face." "No," Jon said at once, heat rising. "No glamours." "Not for me," Mance said. "For the spearwives. Let them be washerwomen. Let them be ugly when they need to be and pretty when a door opens easier for one or the other. The Red Woman doesn't need king's blood for that. She needs to feel useful and she needs a fire. I can give her both without letting her touch what she wants." Ygritte watched Jon, and Jon watched her back because he had learned that sometimes counsel was a look. She lifted one shoulder. "This is the sort of fool's chance he was made for. He'll take it without you or with you. Best be with you." "Very well," Jon said. "Take your wives disguised and your songs unstrung. Bring her out. If she's truly Arya, bring her to me. If not, bring her anyway. A girl is not a bolt." Mance's mouth tilted. "Sometimes she is," he said, and Ygritte laughed despite herself. And the laughter made the plan feel less like a wound someone had planned and more like a thing men could do. Melisandre agreed with a raised brow and a murmured, "Fire hides more than it shows," and set her arts to making women less like themselves. It was a strange magic to watch. smoke and whispers and a shimmer like heat over a summer road suspended in winter air, put a taste in Jon's mouth like pennies. Ygritte watched and spat once, to mark that the gods of the thens and the old ones she did not bother naming did not approve. "Tricks," she said. "I like bows." "So do I," Jon said. Mance left the next night with 6 women who looked like other women and 1 man who could sing. He clasped Jon's forearm and leaned his forehead to Ygritte's with a rough tenderness that did not ask permission. "If I don't come back," he told Jon, "the songs they'll write will be bad. Make sure they're short." "I'll write them," Ygritte said. "They'll be better and worse." He grinned and went into the snow, a shadow that became part of the other shadows and then none at all. The nights that followed were not long in the counting because days were longer in the doing. Jon set watch on the eastern cliffs where the dead had poured down like spilled flour. He sent Tormund with 200 to Long Barrow, because the barrows there had stones that could be made into walls again, and he wanted a place to put mothers where the wind's knife wasn't always at their throats. He sent a man named Rory to Queen's Crown to see if the tower that leaned like a drunk could be made to stand straight with enough men pushing. He sent letters to White Harbor, to the Umbers, to anyone who might remember they were men and not cattle, and he set aside answers and weighed them and did not let himself throw a single one into the fire just to warm his hands. Ygritte took a ranging to the hoods, a cluster of low hills with trees that grew like men with their shoulders hunched. She came back with a gash across her hand and a sack full of black stone that men had laughed at once and now kissed before they went on watch. "There's more there," she told Jon, holding her hand out for him to bind. "Deep, like someone hid it and then forgot the place after a month of rain and a long winter." "Dragonglass," Jon said softly. He held her palm in his and wrapped it tight while Ghost licked her knuckles with a solemnity that made her laugh. "The children, your old wives' tales say the children made it," Ygritte said, watching his face. "Some say," Jon said. He had not told anyone save Sam and Maester Aemon about the Black Gate at the Night Fort, but the memory of that cold mouth haunted him like a song with a missing verse. "Doesn't matter who. We need it." "Good," Ygritte said. "Then you'll come with me next time and lift more. You've got long legs. Might as well fetch bigger sacks." He went, and they found the strata again under a knee of hill where the trees held their breath. Men swung picks and cursed and grinned in equal measure as the black shards came free with a sound like plates cracked in a kitchen. They were there until dusk, and they would have been there past it if Ghost hadn't lifted his head and gone still. Jon felt the cold at the base of his skull the way a harpist feels a string go out of tune. They formed their line in old habit and new fear. The first shapes moved between trees like slow thought. The whites came in singles and then in a rush, and the air got thin without wind. Ygritte's first arrow took an old man who still had a rope around his waist as if he thought he were tied to his life. He went down like a sack. Another arrow shattered glowing blue in a skull that had been Fox's work. More came. "Back," Jon said, because an order is also a prayer, and they gave ground in good order as the pickmen fell in behind with their bags, and Ghost danced in and out with white-flecked jaws. The first white one stepped into the path of retreat like a gentleman onto a ballroom floor, and the cold went deeper. Jon's breath froze at the edges of his vision, and the sound in his ears became glass. He knew the way these ones moved now. He stepped before the men as if that were a step he would always be taking, and the thing raised its spear of ice with the grace of a dancer. Longclaw met it, and the sound made scores of crows cry out of a winter tree. The spear shattered. Ygritte's arrow struck the white at the notch of its collar, where its armor meant to be beautiful and terrible both. The dragonglass made a sound like a difficult breath being let go. The white came apart in brilliance and smoke, and the smell of ancient water made angry. The whites that had been closest sagged and fell, strings cut. They made it to the clearing and the path and the sledge. When they were hours away from the wall, Ygritte let herself laugh, a high, bright sound that let some of the fear boil out without scorching. She touched Jon's cheek with a black-stained hand. "We're getting good at this," she said. "That's awful. Awful is better than dead," Ed offered, panting, and Ygritte pointed to him and laughed again. The letter came 3 nights later, delivered by a man on a foaming horse who didn't get off it before he shouted. and fell off it after he'd said his piece. It smelled of skins and urine and fear, and the seal was an ugly red that said it had been pressed in a hurry and appreciation for ugliness both. Bastard, it began, in strokes so heavy the quill had cut the vellum in places. It went on to say that Stannis was dead with the snow falling around him. It named the women who had gone south and called them whores, and named Mance Rayder and said he would burn at dawn in the Winterfell yard if Jon did not send the Queen's men, and Tormund, and the tamed wildlings, and the Red Witch and his own skin besides. It named Theon Greyjoy and called him Thing. It ended with a flourish that looked like a man slashing at a curtain and hoping to find a door. Jon read it to the council and to the yard because secrets rot in cellars, and Jon had decided the watch had too much rot. Men made the noises men make when the name Bolton enters a room. A hum, a low growl, a catch in the throat that is not crying, not yet. Ygritte's jaw flexed. Mance's boy cried in the arms of the woman who had named herself his mother again, because the babe heard everything that mattered and did not know the names of any of it. It's a lie, Mance said, from a shadow where he had not been, because if anyone could be in a room without being in it, it was him. Men started. I mean, parts of it are. I'm not in his yard. If he caught one of the women, he may call her by my name to make the threats fatter. Stannis. He shook his head. That could go either way. Snow kills a king as cleanly as a peasant. The rest? The bastard of Bolton wants us to come south and die on his terms. He writes like a man who thinks words are soldiers. They can be, Jon said, glancing at the men in the yard who had straightened with fury like a spear up their spines. We won't let them. You want to go? Ygritte said, not gently, not cruelly, just telling a truth even the air had heard. Yes. Jon didn't bother pretending otherwise. But I won't. Not with the dead in the trees and a winter that's bright. Hing like a sleeping bear. I will send Tormund, and Mance if he'll go twice, and men who will kill for the right reasons and come back if they live. I will send a message to the Lord in White Harbor, and another to the mountain clans, and a third to the Umbers. If those men remember their names, Ramsay will have a hard time lighting his candles in the dark. Tormund bellowed with something that might have been approval. I'll go, he said. I've owed that flayed pup a good scare since he stole women from my tents in the old days. I'll take 102 and the rest will be like 102, because I count funny. We'll get in where he has holes and out where he has a fat belly and no eyes. Take Ghost step, Ygritte said. Not Ghost. He's ours. But take the way a wolf moves. Always do, Tormund grinned. Mance rubbed his face with both hands. I'll go too, he said low. If they've got one of mine in that snake pit, she'll be hard to get. She likes hard. He looked at Jon and the look hurt. Keep my boy breathing. That's all the god I've got left. I will, Jon said, and Ygritte put her hand on his back between the shoulder blades and pushed once as if to say, mean it harder. He did. The next day, a storm blew in from the east with a temper that suggested the sea had had enough of men. Eastwatch sent word that the water slammed itself up the quay like a knife, and Cotter Pike could not get a single boat out without losing 2 men. The wind came around hard enough that Castle Black whistled like an instrument someone had forgotten how to play, and shutters banged, and men cursed at the cold because it was something to curse that would not cut them back. The dead did not come in the storm. They were out there thinking heavier thoughts. Ygritte took a duty in the kitchens for a day, because she liked the way men were forced to treat her as a woman carrying stew. And then the next day she went back to training boys with bows because she liked the way boys learned to be men when the string bit their fingers and they bled without making a noise. She taught them to keep their eyes open in the snow, to look at the edges of things and not the center because the center moves more. She taught them to shoot where a thing would be and not where it is. They loved her for it because loving the hand that teaches your hands to be less foolish is easy love. She did not soften for them, not much. She smiled at them when they hit and nodded when they missed and told them in the voice you used to tell stories and threats both that they would hit next time or the time after because that was how a man got to tomorrow. At night, she slept with her back to the wall still, though she no longer reached for a knife that wasn't there. Jon slept in the chair set by his table and sometimes on the floor beside it when the chair made his bones feel like wood. Once, in the black between 2 bells, She rose and stood over him and looked down at his face and saw the boy who had come into their cave with a silly idea of honor and a large idea of love. She leaned and set her lips to his forehead and then lay on the floor beside his couch and slid her hand under the furs to find his, and he woke without waking all the way and threaded their fingers. In the morning they didn't speak of it because some things do better without words until they want them. Weeks tightened. Tormund and Mance slipped away on a night that broke into stars about an hour before midnight and so seemed kinder than it was. They went with men who could move where they had not been given leave, and with women who could become no one when a guard's eye touched them. Jon watched them go from the top of the third walk. Ygritte stood beside him and did not say cheer or good luck or any other fool's request. The snow took the shapes and made them into other shapes and then into none. Ghost healed. He limped for a week with an offended dignity and then stopped limping and started letting the men who had watched him limp think he still did so he could surprise them. He seemed to take pleasure in haunting the corridors when Melisandre passed, setting one white paw down noiselessly after the other with a care he did not save for any other. Once, when she stepped out into the yard and looked up to find him on the parapet, he sat down and yawned hugely, tongue lolling, as if to say that wolves had better things to do than burn. Shireen found Ygritte in the laundry 2 afternoons running and watched her wring out a shirt with practiced violence. On the third afternoon, she brought a slate and chalk. "Would you like to learn your letters?" she asked, very grand. "You could leave me if you like, but I'm faster than Maester Aemon and my hand doesn't shake and I don't mind when people curse." "What letters?" Ygritte asked suspiciously. "These," Shireen said, and drew an A that looked like a small tent. "They are like little people who stand behind your words. If you learn them, you can send your words walking to other people. It's like being a witch but with less fire." Ygritte looked at the mark. Something moved under her face like ice cracking on a stream and relacing itself. "All right, teach me how to stick little men to a board." Later, when Jon teased her, she grabbed his ear and tugged. "You like it when a girl puts sharp things into you," she said. "This is sharper. Don't be jealous." He wasn't. He sat with them one afternoon and watched Shireen's small, neat hand make men on the slate and Ygritte's bigger, scarred hand follow, reluctant at first and then more sure. "You write like a crow," Ygritte told Shireen, amused. "Peck, peck, peck." "And you write like a bear," Shireen returned, delighted. "But better every time." Celis looked on this with a mouth that wanted to disapprove of everything and a pair of eyes that could not quite find a good place to land their disapproval. "It is good for the savages to be civilized," she knew, and said at supper. "Reading improves the soul. It improves the chances of getting a letter where it needs to go," Jon said mildly. "Souls are stubborn things. Like wildlings," she said. "Like queens," Ygritte murmured under her breath in the old language, and Jon coughed to cover a laugh that wanted to betray him. "Things happen even when nothing happens. This is the truth men forget in summer and remember in winter. The snow fell twice in one day and then none for a week and then all at once like a blanket thrown over a fire. The dead came to the trees again and were pushed back again, less by heroics than by oil and glass and the dull habit of not giving in. A raven came from Eastwatch with a message wrapped in oilcloth. The seas had calmed, but the ice had its own will. A raven came from White Harbor with flourishes. Wyman Manderley had eaten a fry. He didn't write that, not in so many words, but it lived between the lines like a fish in a pond. And then, like a knife placed point first on a table of maps, there was a tapping at the door. Jon looked up from the charter of Long Barrow with his mind still in the measure of stones. Ygritte was across the room with her feet bare and her hair down, reading aloud to herself from the slate with a scowl that meant she wanted to break the little men in half and was proud not to. She looked up like a cat does when something enters the room that only a cat can hear. Ghost was already at the door with his nose pressed to the wood, breathing the story on the other side. "Come," Jon said. The door opened. The man who stood there looked like a scribe who had been left out in a storm, and he smelled like horse and iron and fear and the edges of a miracle. He took 2 steps, then another, not yet trusting his legs. "Lord Commander," he said, and then he laughed in a way that had wept on the way to becoming a laugh and hadn't quite made it yet. "I've a girl for you." She was behind him, wrapped in a brown cloak, hair greasy with the kind of grease that isn't about filth, but about hiding a smell a pursuing dog might love. She lifted her face, and the light in the room, poor as it was, scraped along features John had loved since he had been a boy, staring at a sister who held her chin in a way that said she'd break something important if the world didn't let her pass. The girl's eyes were wider. The skin at her mouth was cracked. She wobbled a little when she tried to steady herself under all their eyes. "Arya?" John said, and the name came out in a voice he had sworn to keep crisp and neat, and it broke like a boy's and shamed him not at all. "I'm not," she said. Her voice was harsh as a dry leaf crushed in a hand. "I'm not Arya. They told me to say I was. They beat me when I got it wrong. My name is Jane. Please don't send me back. Please, please." John went to one knee so quickly something pulled in his side. He didn't care. He took her hands. They were cold and small and terrible and alive. "No one will send you back," he said. "No one who breathes the air in this place will let that happen." The man who had brought her peeled a scarf from his face. Mance Rayder's grin flashed wolf-bright and then went away because there was no grin for this. "The pup doesn't like losing his toys," he said, tossing a small bundle onto John's table. It thumped. It unrolled. A flayed man pin fell out and clinked on the wood. "He'll come scratching at your door with his letter blade again. But he scratches a lot of doors. Our turn." He looked down at the girl as if his own daughter had walked into the room with another face. "You're brave," he told her roughly. "Braver than any lordling I ever saw stand up to a cold night." She looked up at him as if he were a tree she might climb if she were not so tired. "I was brave because I pretended to be someone who is brave," she said. "I don't know if I am." "You are," Ygritte said from the corner, fierce in that particular way she had when she met another woman whose stories had not been told to her first. "You are now." She moved to the hearth and fumbled for a mug and filled it with broth from a pot that always sat warming there. She thrust it into the girl's hands. "Drink. Then we'll put your feet in warm water and your head on a pillow and you can grieve when you've rested." "I don't have any grief," Jane said in a small voice. "Only fear." "That too," Ygritte said. "It's a kind of grief. Drink." They put her in a bed near Shireen's and put two women on either side who would bite anyone who tried to take her and set Ghost to lie along the foot like a fallen tree. She slept in fits for a day and woke speaking names that weren't hers and then slept again. When she woke completely, Shireen showed her a slate and wrote S and A and F and E, and Jane watched the letters make a fence around the bed and cried and didn't know why she was crying because sometimes a fence is safer than any sword. Mance ate stew in John's chamber as if it were a feast and drank 2 mugs of wine, and then slumped like a man who had cut a rope that had been around his throat too long. He told his story in a voice that would do for a song later if anyone wanted it, and no one did. He said Ramsay had learned to love the sound men make when they cannot scream because there's a gag in their mouth and the scream has to come out through their eyes. He said the snows had begun to move like white wolves under your feet, and if you didn't learn to walk with them, they'd roll you. He said the women had been more than he deserved and that one had died because he'd miscounted a heartbeat. And he said her name, and Ygritte put her hand on his shoulder and left it there until he finished saying it. Ravens flew. They always did. One from Winterfell promised revenge in a hand that showed a boy's attempt at a man's swagger. One from White Harbor came heavy with flourishes, and folded into it were 3 sentences that said more than the rest. There are men at Moat Cailin with eyes in their heads. Do not bleed for us yet. We will remember who bled when we count. Stannis sent no word. Snow has no pen. Men's mouths filled the gap. Some said he had died on a frozen lake that cracked like a mirror. Some said he had eaten his horse and laughed while he did it. Some said he had won a battle no one could see and then gone into the dark and would come out in spring like a root with a new tendril. Life went on, which is to say there were 100 ways to die and men picked different ones. A builder fell from a parapet with his hands full of nails, and they scattered like black rain on the snow. A child choked on a chip of hard bread, and a woman with smarts slapped his back until the bread flew and then slapped him again out of relief. A couple wed under the wall by old vows and exchanged a knife and a braid instead of rings. A boy who had come north with Tormund at 12 and thought himself a man was made a man in the alley behind the granary by a spear-wife older than his mother, and went around the next day with a grin so stupid Ygritte threatened to box it off his face. Jon slept when he could. He dreamed when he slept. Sometimes he dreamed he was in the caves with the water's voice and a heat that didn't require a fire. Sometimes he dreamed he was standing at the black gate of the night fort and a face of ice and old would ask him to name his mother and he could not remember. Sometimes he dreamed that he held a sword so cold it burned his hands, and it wasn't Longclaw and it wasn't any sword he'd ever seen, and when he woke his fingers ached as if they'd been gripping something too hard for too long. On a morning when the sky had the color of a belly scar, a horn sounded from Eastwatch. The sound rose thin over the snow, and men stiffened at it the way dogs stiffen at a cry they do not love. Cotter Pike's letter arrived on a gull-gray bird with a temper and a tear in its tail. Said simply, "They come by sea, by sea." Jon had not imagined the dead walking on water. He had imagined them silent through trees, and he had learned not to imagine because imagination wastes strength. He stood with the letter in his hand and felt a cold that came from a new direction. Ygritte's hand closed over his wrist. "Seals haul up on ice," she said. "Wolves swim rivers. Why not dead men by sea? They drown like the rest, but they don't stay drowned." "Ed," Jon said, and Ed was already moving, and the eastward ravens were already being woken from their crop-heavy sleep, and men were already throwing on cloaks and reaching for packs. "We go." "You go and I go," Ygritte said. "You stay and I go," Jon said, out of habit, and then he met her stare and let the habit go like steam from a kettle. "You go," he said. "You always go." Cotter Pike met them on the quay with his beard rimed and his eyes hot in a face gone nearly blue. The sea showed its teeth and then hid them behind a smile of ice. Beyond the harbor, floes ground together with a teeth-on-teeth sound that made men's shoulders twitch. Farther out, the water was black where it was not white, and white where it was not black. The line of the horizon held nothing until it held something you didn't want. They came riding the floes, or the floes came carrying them, and there was no difference. They stood in ranks at first, neat as an army on a drill field, and then they moved with the ice, and the ice moved as if it had a mind, opening a lane here, driving one floe against another there. Some tumbled into the water and the water took them. Some climbed back out with the patient will that makes fish martyrs. Between them, farther back, something walked that bent the light around it like heat and made the air go sharp. "Scorpions," Jon said. "Oil. Men with torches. Barrels here and here. Drive the fire across the ice. Make lanes where we want them, not where the sea does." "You heard the boy," Cotter Pike shouted in a voice that could have driven sheep off a cliff. "Move your arses." He shot Jon a look. "You've grown teeth," he said. "Good. Bite the right things." They did what men do when winter is climbing the stairs toward their hearthroom. They made a mess and called it a plan, and then they held on. The first volley from the scorpions arced beautifully and uselessly until the bolts hit the ice and stuck there, and the flaming rope snapped off and skittered like a glowing worm. The second volley found flesh that wasn't, and the darts went through it like knives through meat left too long in the sun. It slowed them. It was enough. The oil went out in a black sheet. The torches followed with a roar that pushed men back on their heels and then dragged them forward again because they liked roaring better than not. The fire burned on the ice strangely, in a dozen small lakes that slid and joined and broke apart with the floes. The dead hesitated at it the way a man hesitates at a smell he used to love and now thinks might be wrong. Some walked into it. Some walked around. The white ones stood at the back and watched and did not come near. Ygritte moved along the quay with a quiver of black glass at her hip and her bow strung and in her hand the way a woman holds her child. She shot without hurry, steady. An arrow in a throat, an arrow in an eye, an arrow in a mouth. She did not blink when faces caved or when bodies fell in the fire and made smells that would live in men's coats for weeks. Ghost took the wall that joined the watchtower to the fish sheds and made it his own, jumping down into the press and out again, dragging pieces, harrying feet, worrying ankles with cheerful savagery. He yelped once when a dart of ice skittered past and took a bit of ear. He shook himself and refused to learn the lesson the universe had tried to teach him. On the third hour of the fight, the figure at the back moved. It lifted a hand. No wind blew, but the fire nearest it guttered, and men set their shoulders and thought abo. UT prayers they had not used since they were boys. John felt the presence like a knife edge pressed along his spine. He knew, in that mad, bright way a man knows in a fight, that if he let the thing look at him, he would stop being himself and start being something else. He did not let it look at him. He moved. He called to Ed. He called to Cotter. He did not call to Melisandre because she had already come. She came down the quay all in red, absurd and perfect, the color of life in a place that had forgotten it. She held her hands out and spoke words that made the air bank and flare. Bank and flare. The fire rose. It did not obey. It liked her voice, but it liked its own mind more. Still, it rose. John saw the line of the dead waver. He saw the figure at the back tilt its head, very slightly, like a man hearing a song he cannot place. He took the 2 breaths the moment offered and then spent them. Now, he shouted, and the scorpions loosed again, and the men with torches flung flame, and Ygritte's arrow flew at the thing at the back and shattered an inch from its face with a sound like a laugh cut short. "Close enough," she said between her teeth. They held until the light got poor. Men were counting their arrows and finding their quivers empty and finding again the bottom of courage where men hate to put their hands. The line of the dead shifted, and then shifted again in a way that might have been withdrawal and might have been the sea. The figure at the back turned and walked away across a flow as if walking across a polished floor, and the others went with it or fell where they stood and sank. The fire fluttered on the ice and died. Cotter Pike spat into the water and then thought better of it and spat onto the quay. "If they can walk on the bloody sea," he said. "We've lost a wall. We've gained one too," John said, chest heaving. He gestured at the miles of broken ice, the black water, the lanes of living flame. "We know that fire bites through the ice. We'll lay it where we want next time. We make harrows and ropes and hooks, and maybe next time we pull a king off his feet." Cotter Pike eyed him as if he were a fish he hadn't decided to eat yet. "You think like a man who's stopped caring whether his plan gets him killed." "I think like a man who's noticed I'm going to die anyway," John said. "I'd rather pick where." Back at Castle Black, Jane had woken into a life she could not believe. She flinched at footsteps in hallways. She jumped at laughter. Shireen put her at the table and set a cup before her and asked if she might write her name. Jane wrote it slowly. Lettermen bent like stubborn goats and straightened and fell over and got up again, and when she had written it twice she cried again and didn't know why. Celis came once and looked at her as if she were a stack of wood that had not been seasoned properly and said that girls who lied about their names should be whipped. Ygritte stepped between them and smiled with all her teeth and said the queen could try her hand if she liked. Celis went away with her mouth pinched. Melisandre watched with her head tilted and her eyes soft and distant at once and asked Jane what she dreamed. And Jane said she dreamed of flaying, and the red woman's mouth softened in a way that was not kind but was perhaps pity. When John returned from Eastwatch with the smell of smoke in his hair and the sound of ice in his ears, he found a raven from Old Town waiting with a broken seal. The hand that had written the words had shaken. The words were clear all the same. Maester Aemon was dead aboard the Cinnamon Wind, off Bravos. He had died still talking, and the last thing he had said had been dragon. He had asked Sam to tell John to look to the east for fire that may not love him and to the north for a cold that knew his name. Sam had written at the bottom in a cramped, tear-smudged hand that he would come back faster now because there was nothing left to keep him there except studying and fear, and he would try to be equal to both. John sat with the letter and read it again and again until the words wore thin. Shireen came and sat by him and put her small hand on his knee and said nothing. Ygritte stood at the window slit with her arms folded and her eyes on the yard and said nothing. The room was full of things unsaid and none of them were lies. "He was the oldest man I ever knew," John said at last, and the uselessness of the sentence hurt. "He was kind without making it a weakness. He saw more than men with eyes. He liked my stories," Shireen said, voice small. "He liked your courage," John said. "And you're quiet." Ygritte turned. "The old die," she said. "I've buried grandfathers in the snow with their whiskers frozen. doesn't make it not hurt. But I know this, he'd want you to eat and sleep and then go put your head in a place where it will get cut off unless you move. That's what old men who liked the world always want. John smiled without feeling it touch anything but his mouth. You're very comforting. I am what I am, she said. You knew that when you came into my cave the first time. I thought you'd kill me in the morning, he said. I still might, she said, and the smile landed where smiles go to live. They took Eamon's chain and wrapped it in cloth and set it in a coffer that had once held candles. And John placed it on the highest shelf in the rookery. The ravens regarded it with bright, greedy eyes, as if they recognized in the metal something that had learned to be heavy. He told Satin to keep the shelf clean and the coffer dry, and Satin nodded and bit his lip hard enough to hurt. Tormund came back on a day when the wind had teeth again, with 30 fewer men than he had taken and twice as many stories. We did not put a spear into the pup, he said, but we took 3 bites out of his belly he'll not hide with a sash. He told them about Carhold men who had reeled between their lord and their honor like drunk, men trying to decide which ditch to piss in. He told them of a girl with half her hair burned who had hidden 3 little ones under hay and stood outside with a stick as if it were a spear. He told them about the boy who had stabbed a guard in the thigh and then cried because he had never hurt a man before and didn't like it. And Mance? John asked, though asking a question you can answer and won't like isn't a talent so much as a rough habit. Went east, Tormund said. He's good at going. He scratched his beard. Said you could keep his boy until he could teach him swear words proper. I'll keep him, John said. He'll teach me the words first. Not with Shireen around, Ygritte muttered, and Tormund roared and clapped her on the back hard enough to make her stumble. The winter rode them hard and then gave them a day with a blue sky that made men remember there had been other seasons. John took that day like a rare coin and spent it on the new gift. He rode with Ygritte and 5 and Ghost and a cart of seed and nails and a bundle of knives and 2 books of numbers no one but him would read, and they went as far as a little low hill where an orchard had been 30 years since and might be again. The trees were black bones in the snow and a fox had made a den under one stump. A woman in a patched cloak came out of a house that was half shadow and half stubbornness and looked them over with the practiced suspicion of someone who had seen too many people come up her path uninvited. You're the one they call Snow, she said. I am, John said. You're the one stole the girl and stole a baby and sent him to sea, they say, she said. I sent a baby to a place where he would not be set on fire by a king's men, John said. I stole a girl back from a monster with a flayed man on his flags. She studied him for a long moment. Good, she said. You got seed. I do, John said and handed her the bag. And nails. Good, she said again. You got promises? I do, John said. I promised to send men to help mend the roof and a man to teach numbers so your boys don't get cheated when men come by to take what you have for less than it's worth. And the South? The woman asked, eyes keen. What does the South say about us planting your seed and binding our roofs with your nails and taking your numbers into our heads? They say many things, John said. I listen to those that have food in them. He looked at the orchard. This will be an orchard again. Maybe, the woman said, if the world stops trying to kill us before we can bring the cider to a boil. She hefted the bag. You want a drink? He wanted every man to have a drink and none to drown. He shook his head anyway. Another time. Save it. They rode back in a light that made the trees look like pens on white parchment, and Ygritte leaned close and chuffed her breath to warm his cheek. You walk through promises like a man crossing a frozen river, she said. You keep your feet over the thicker places and hope there aren't cracks that didn't show. There are always cracks that don't show, John said. Our work is to walk anyway. At dusk, Melisandre came to him with a face that had seen a thing it did not love. I looked into the fire, she said. You always do, he said, because the edge in her voice needed blunting before it cut the wrong thing. This time, she said, ignoring him, I saw a blade that burned without burning. I saw a hand holding it. Not your hand. Not my king's. A woman's hand. It was bright. It harmed what cannot be harmed. It made the dead stop and consider their choices. Good, Ygritte said cheerfully from the hearth. "Find her and bring her here. We'll let her soak her feet, then send her out ahead of us." Melisandre didn't smile, but something at the corner of her mouth twitched. "She was far away," she said. "She was in a city of bells. She walked with men whose faces were not their faces. She looked over the water and saw it crack. She is fire's beggar. She is not ours." Her eyes moved back to Jon. "You will have to manage without my king." "I already am," Jon said. The words came out harder than he had meant, but he didn't take them back. "You and I, boy," Melisandre murmured. "We are both stubborn." "Good," Ygritte said again. "I would hate to lean my back on a woman who leaned. I prefer walls." That night, the wind backed around and found a new crack. Men slept and did not. Ghost paced the yard and stopped at the granary and lowered his head and sniffed as if he knew a mouse would become a lion at any moment. Jon slept and dreamed that the wall had a mouth and it asked for a song, and he could not sing, and Ygritte sang instead, and the wall sighed and said thank you with its stones. Morning brought a sky like a bruised apple and news. A band of wildlings living in a cluster near the Queen's Crown had been harried by dead in the night. The tracks went east. Jon took 20 and Ygritte took 10, and they followed the tracks until the trees grew sparse and the open lay like a jaw. They found them near the old stone causeway, back to back around a cart, a circle of breath hanging like a wreath. 2 children cried without tears. A woman stood with a knife in one hand and a second in her teeth because her hands were both already busy. They broke the press with fire and with black glass and with the white wolf's white rage. Jon found himself face to face with a thing that had once been a smith. The arm still had the ghost of muscle on it, and realized with a cold little click that the dead remembered how to use their hands. He lost a glove. He didn't lose his fingers. He filed the knowledge away with the other pieces that would be a plan one day if he lived long enough to make one. After, when the children had stopped hiccuping and the women had stopped shaking, Ygritte counted noses and frowned. "There were 18, she said. "I count 16. They found the last 2 at the edge of the where the old stones made a false shore. They had gone out onto it thinking it would hold, and the ice had cracked and the black had taken them. The bodies hadn't sunk. They floated just under the skin of ice like fish that had been surprised by cold. Ygritte leaned on Jon and breathed tight through her nose. "I hate the water," she said. "It's a liar." "I thought you hated all the South's laws most," he said. "I can hate more than one thing," she said, and her hands were fists so tight the knuckles looked like teeth through skin. "Mostly I hate not being able to do anything now for a thing that needs doing." She looked up. "We'll bring them in the spring, when the ice lets go." "We will," Jon said. He meant it. He would make the time because time would not make him, and there are things you give men so they remember another way to live. In late winter, snow fell with a texture like cotton, and for a week the world was muffled and soft. Men slept and dreamed and were not safer because of it. Mance wrote once, and the letter smelled like pitch and old hay and read like a man who had learned the trick of paring words to the bone to save weight. He said the bastard had sent a raven with a woman's finger in a box. He said the woman it had belonged to had stolen a ring from Ramsay's bedside and left a piece of skin in his cuff. He said he had laughed and then stopped laughing. He said he would not come in from the cold until the cold made him. The next attack on the wall came not from the north and not from the sea but from the sky. A storm roared down out of nowhere and pelleted the ice face with hail so large men could have used it to cool casks. And the hail broke and slid and turned to slush that found small cracks and made them larger. A fissure opened near the 7th brig. Yarwick made a noise like a priest being told his god's roof leaks. "We seal it or we lose this section when the melt comes," he said. "When the melt comes, there'll be nothing left to seal with." "We seal it now," Jon said. "Men on belays. Lime if we have it. Pitch if we don't." "Who'll go?" Yarwick asked. Jon looked at the men who had moved with every order for months. And then he looked at the ice and thought of the dream where it had asked for a song. "I will," he said. "And Ed. And Rory. And that boy who can't stop smiling because he knows what a warm bed is now." "I can stop," the boy protested. And Jon laughed despite the ice already in his mouth. They went up on ropes in a wind that wanted them. The ice face swelled around them in blue veils and white scars, older than any of them would ever be, older than songs remembered the words to. Jon drove the first wedge in and set his weight on it and felt the whole wall respond like a living thing shifting its shoulders. He moved because stopping would teach his body another story. Ed came behind him cursing in an old tongue he'd invented for the purpose. Ygritte stood below with her hand over her eyes, and when she took her hand down for a moment her mouth was a hard, thin line that said if he fell she would build a wall of bones with her bare hands and then beat him back to life to insult him properly. They set the pitch and the stone dust and the snow into the crack and tamped it with gloved hands and cursed when the wind licked it away before it could bite. They did it again, and again, and the fourth time the mixture set like a promise and hardened. When they let themselves down, Jon's arms shook and his legs forgot their jobs for a moment and Ghost licked his face like a wet dog. Ygritte hit his arm, hard. He grinned like a fool and let the grin be as ugly as it needed to be, and she hit him again softer and then touched his cheek, bewildered by wanting to touch and wanting to hurt him both. "Stop doing that," she said. "I will," he lied. She laughed, and it sounded like mercy for both of them. Spring approached like a man who doesn't want to come to a house where his in-laws wait. The days shortened in their cold and lengthened in their light. The dead came twice more and were held twice more. Once one of the White Ones mounted the stairs of the switchback with the air of a lord inspecting his estate, and Jon met him in the middle and knocked him to a shine with Longclaw and an oath he had learned in the yard at Winterfell and had not used since his childhood. The oath did not help. The sword did. The white came apart with a sound like a bell knifed through, and the whites within a dozen strides collapsed as if they realized all at once that they had meant to be elsewhere. Men cheered less loudly. Men cheered as if they had learned that tomorrow might take their breath between a spoonful of soup and the next. They cheered anyway. On a day like that, shamed by the fragile way Joy stood in the yard, Jon took Ygritte's hand and led her up the long steps to the top of the wall. They stood against the sky and let it scrape them. The forest was a low sea. The air was a blade and a bomb. "What did you steal me for, Crow?" she asked, wary and curious both. "You're not giving me to a god, are you? He'd send me back. I cut my own meat." He turned her hand over and pressed a twisted piece of iron into the palm. Not a ring, not a noble's above-salt showpiece, just a hammered shape with 2 points where the smith had failed and then decided to call it intended. "We can't be wed," he said. "Not by the vows I took. Not by the rites your people use either, not properly. But I can give you a token that says I will stand where you stand and put my body between yours and whatever comes through the door, and I can ask you to do the same, and I can call that promise something that matters." She stared at the iron as if it might bite her. "You've no sense," she said, voice very rough. "None." "I don't," he agreed. "Say yes anyway." "I am free folk," she said and lifted her chin. "I say yes to myself and any echoes can do as they will. I'll keep you. If why? Oh, you run, I'll drag you back by your ears. If you die, I'll kick at your grave until you get up." She closed her hand over the iron and then opened it again and threaded it on a piece of leather and tied it around her wrist. "Now kiss me." He did, and the wind took it and made it colder and better. Ghost sat with his jaws open like a grin and watched as if this were a hunt he could approve. When they broke apart, Ygritte put her forehead hard to Jon's and said, "There, we're winter married. Counts more. Summer marriages are for flowers." They went down arm in arm, and if men looked they let them look. Ed rolled his eyes and said to no one in particular, "Now the stew will be salty for a week." And the yard breathed with them, and it was good. By the time the ice let go of the 2 dead at the Queen's Crown Causeway, the world had changed again. Ravens had come in a cluster with news from the Trident. A boy who called himself king had lost a battle and found a new lord to curry in the same hour. A ship had put in at Eastwatch with Ironborn who had more arrogance than food. Davos had come on a weathered cog with a face like a coat he had slept in and the same steadiness as always. He stood before Jon and said, "It goes badly for the king," without wasting words on lies, and Jon said, "It goes badly for the world." And they stood like that for a moment as if waiting for a third voice to tell them a joke and didn't get one. Then Davos asked to see Shireen, and Jon said yes, and Celis made a noise like a cat brought into a bath, and Davos looked at Celis and at the girl and did not speak except to say, "Princess," and a silence moved through the room like a presence. Davos brought a story too. A boy on Skagos with a wolf on his shoulder. Jon felt the ache that knew his name turn and look at it with interest. "Rickon?" he asked, too afraid to put the word in front of the question. Davos nodded. "They say, a wild island with wild men and a boy with a wild heart. I'll go if you tell me to." "I can't spare you," Jon said, and the words cost, because the idea of Winterfell's youngest wolf coming home alive could have heated a room. "And yet I'm telling you to go." He looked at Celis and did not bother to ask permission. "Bring him back," he told Davos. "Tell him that we're holding this wall and I need him to hold a different sort of wall. Tell him that his father died with a sword in his hands, but he doesn't have to. Tell him to run toward home." Davos bowed. He said, simple as bread. When the two dead at the causeway released and came to the surface like secrets that refused to stay buried, Jon and Ygritte went with a small party, and they brought them to the hill, and the mothers wept and the men dug and the children watched and made that particular solemn expression children make when the world shows them it can be cruel and dignified at once. Ghost stood at the edge of the grave and sighed, and Shireen sang a small, cracked song for them that she had learned from a Braavosi sailor, and Melisandre stood apart and watched the smoke from her brazier go up and said nothing, which was its own magic. Spring came. It came like a rumor at first. A day when the snow fell wet, a week where men took their gloves off and counted their fingers without fear. The dead came less often and watched more. Men were born. Men died in ordinary ways. The orchard woman sent a jug of cider and it was sour and perfect, and when Jon drank it he thought of Trunks swelling and the daughter she would put into the world, and he thought of Sam, somewhere south, walking in a place with red roofs and cobbles that remembered old boots. The day the first real thaw set in, the ice on the wall moaned and shifted in a way that made men and birds fall silent. The sound went down through stones and up through skin and into the air and then out. Men looked at one another and some crossed themselves in ways both new and old. "Another crack?" Yarwick asked, alarm narrowed to a point. "No," Jon said softly. "It's waking." "Walls don't sleep," Yarwick said. "Everything sleeps," Jon said. "Everything wakes." He put his hand on the stone and felt a sensation like a cat flexing its paw in his palm. Not pain, not relief, something in between. He laughed once, unexpectedly. Felt like hope sour, as Ygritte would say. He would drink it anyway. On a warm day, the only word for it was warm. Jane brought out a length of cloth Shireen had taught her to stitch and shyly showed Ygritte the letters she had put in it. Jane, and then not Arya, and then safe. Ygritte touched the careful letters with a calloused finger. "You made little men behave," she said, pride and mischief mixed. "I think I made friends," Jane whispered, and Ygritte nodded. "You did that first," she said. That night, Jon lay on his back in his narrow bed and listened to the castle breathe. It does when you stand still enough and want to hear it. It breathed through cracks and through men and through the wolf and through the woman who slept beside his bed on the floor because she liked hard places. He thought of all he had not yet done, all he might, and he did not make a list because there are kinds of weight you don't need to write down to remember. He closed his eyes and dreamed of a boy with a wild heart and a wolf on his shoulder and of a girl with a blade of light in her hand, far away, who had never met him and would break his heart anyway by existing. He dreamed of winter's long teeth and of the way a man can fit his hand between them and hold them apart for a breath, for another. He woke before dawn and went to the top of the wall. Ygritte followed because she always did when he walked like a man who had dreamed a thing too large for a room. They stood in the violet light and watched the north breathe, and he took her hand and she took his and they stood until the winter lit itself brighter and the day moved. Below them, men rose. Fire took hold. Someone cursed, someone laughed, someone sang. The gods, or the lack of them, turned in their sleep and showed another face. On the far shore, where the sea had been black and ice, there was a low line of fog that looked, for a moment, like smoke from a long, low fire. It held like a question. It thinned. It held. "Once we get through this," Ed said without meaning to, somewhere behind them, starting his own day as he always did, in the middle of someone else's thought. "We'll have the next thing," Jon said, and squeezed Ygritte's hand and let her squeeze back until it hurt, because hurt that comes from living is a luxury worth paying for. "That's the life?" Ygritte said again, not softly, not loudly, as if she were reminding the wall itself that it was true. Then she tugged his hand once, hard, and they went down together to light the first fires and count what needed counting and order what needed ordering and do the small brave things that make a world out of winter. The days that followed made themselves with their own hands. They were not gentle hands, and they were not always just, but they were steady. Eastwatch sent word of a ship of Lyseni pirates trying to sneak in under night with the thought of snatching what can be snatched from a place men thought too busy with dead to notice the living stealing. Cotter Pike tied their captain to a post and let the gulls explain maritime law to him, and then sent the men on their way with a barrel of pork and a warning and a good story to tell about the man who had frightened them into not stealing. A mother bore twins in the steward's house and named them Snow and Brine, and Ygritte declared it stupid and perfect and kissed both wrinkled heads anyway. Ghost treed a foolish thief who had come north from Molestown thinking the watch too tired to watch, and Jon had the man's fingers broken and then set, and the man had the decency to thank him for choosing that mercy, which made Jon feel sick. He went to Ygritte afterward and let her strike him once in the chest with the heel of her hand to knock sense back in, and then he slept, and then he woke, and it was morning again. News came of Davos's ship crushed in drift ice north of Skagos, and then news came of Davos landing with a plank and stubbornness and vanishing into the trees, and then nothing for weeks, and then a raven with a feather that could only have come from a Skagosi shorebird. Jon knew his feathers now, bearing a single word: coming. "Wolves always take the longest way around," Ygritte said. "They like to read the story with their noses before they choose where to sit. When Rickon came, he did not come as a prince. He came dirty and tall for his years and angry the way boys are angry when all their teachers have been loss and cold and hunger. He came with a giant's tooth on a thong around his neck and a scar under one eye and a wolf with gray in him already who moved like a storm taught to behave. He came with Davos behind him, blaze white with frostburn and smiling because he had brought a piece of the world back to a place that needed it." Rickon didn't run to Jon. He stood in the yard and stared at the wall and the yards and the men and the smell of old salt and said, "I remember this," in a voice that hadn't decided whether to squeak or break. Then he looked at Jon and tilted his head and said, "You got older," as if accusing him. "So did you," Jon said, and then that was done and they were stumbling into one another and knocking the air out of chests, and Ghost was on his hind legs whining like a puppy and the gray wolf, and he went around one another in an old dance that had been written before both of them. Rickon ate like a boy who doesn't think there will be another meal, and he drank and then didn't, because he was learning again that you can have enough and not make yourself sick. He stood under the wall and counted stones and failed and tried again. He asked for Bran without asking, and Jon answered by not answering, and Rickon looked at him like that and didn't cry, and Jon loved him for not crying and hated that he had learned not to. He went to Ygritte and stood with his hands in his pockets as if ready to steal and said, "You're the one who stole Jon." And Ygritte liked him at once for the insult, said like a friend. "I stole him," she said. "He didn't give me much of a chase. He's lazy." Rickon considered this and then nodded, solemn. "I can make him run," he promised. "You can try," Jon said. And Rickon's grin, when it broke, was the first clear summer thing that had happened in the yard in months. On a bright day soon after, with a wind that smelled of wet rock instead of frozen dead, Melisandre lit a brazier and called a small, quiet gathering to the yard. Celis stood stiff as carved wood. Shireen clutched her book like a shield. Davos hovered in a way that said he was not going to let anything happen to the girl while his lungs had breath. Rickon came because he heard the word fire and wanted to see what people made of it this far north. Ygritte stood with her arms folded and her bow unstrung on her back. Jon stood because he had decided to stand at every ceremony anyone announced, because the world had forgotten how to make rituals and he intended to remind it, even if they were not his. "We light this fire," Melisandre said, "for those who sleep, to bring them light, not to wake them," a glance like a blade at Celis. "Because the waking is not ours to command. Light enough in the world. If we stoke it, we'll push the shadows back." Her voice held none of the sharpness it had when she talked of kings. It was gentle. Jon felt a kind of sadness fill him, not because he agreed, but because he heard a woman in a red cloak who had been sure of so much she was wrong about say a thing she might be right about. They burned a handful of wood. They burned nothing with a name. Men warmed their hands and smiled at one another without being forced. "Hen, it was done," Rickon said, loud enough for 3 men to hear and 20 to tell later. "If all fires are like that, I don't mind them." And Shireen laughed and put a hand over her mouth as if someone might take the sound away from her, and Davos smiled at Jon with his eyes. The thaw went on. Roads appeared out of the snow like writing rubbed clean on a slate. The dead came less and the living moved more. Jon sent men south with seed and plans and rough maps with X marks where a man might find a roof still mostly together. He sent others north to watch and come back if they found something that needed more men than they could carry with them. He sent letters to Manderley and received back 3 separate replies, one praising his prudence, one chiding his arrogance, one enclosing a song about a fish with a phrase face. He sent a letter to the Umbers and received 2 boar tusks and a piece of cured meat and the word ready. Ygritte's slate filled with men. She wrote Tormund like a mountain with a hat, and she wrote Jon like a ladder she intended to climb, and she wrote her own name like a mark you put on a door to tell friends they can come in. She took the iron ring from her wrist one night and set it on the table and said, "I should have a better thing." And Jon said, "No," and pushed it back, and she laughed because sometimes men need to be told they've done something right while they are still doing it. Mance came back with 3 women and a limp. He had not brought any of the spearwives who had gone with him the first time because 2 were dead and one had chosen to stay to haunt Bolton's dreams from inside his walls. He had brought instead a bit of news like a small fire, the North gathering while trying not to be seen. "They're slow," he said. "They're careful. They've seen too many men die under banners to love them. But they're moving. Your letter had legs. It ran." "It's not my letter anymore," Jon said. "If it moves because men lend it their feet." Mance sat and rubbed his knee. "You sound like a man who wants someone else to carry this weight," he said amiably. "I am," Jon said. "I want everyone to carry it. That's the point." "You're learning," Mance said. "Good. Now teach them." On the first day that men could go out onto the road to Molestown without needing to tie a rope door to find the way back if a squall hit, Jon went with Ygritte and Rickon and Davos and a dozen others. They walked through a world revealing itself. Burst barrels hiding under old straw, bones of deer bleached to a pale that glowed in patches of sun where the snow had turned glassy and thin, stones that remembered shapes the snow had rounded. Molestown was what it always had been, half underground, half shameless. The whores had different faces and the same mouths. The old woman who had been the madam now sold stew from a pot so large it could hide 3 secrets and a dog. She didn't curtsy to Jon, and he didn't expect her to. He bought a cup and paid double and told her he wanted to hear of any men who came talking too loud about the wrong things. And she told him she always had and she always would, because if her town burned she lost too much and she would rather sell a secret than her bed. Rickon went down the steps to the tunnels with Davos on his shoulder, as if Davos were a net that would catch him if he fell. Ygritte stood at the mouth and made a face and went down anyway. They all came up smelling of earth and smoke and something like happiness. If the world had ended there, it would have been a story a man could stand to hear again. It didn't, which is its habit. One day after, at dusk, with the snow crust stiff and the light orange as a fox's skin through the lower trunks of pines, a horn blew from the north with a note Jon had not heard in weeks. It had urgency in it. It had numbers. He was at the wall before the second note cut the air. Men followed because men followed him now as easily as they had followed men older and worse and better. Ygritte was with him. Ghost was with him. Rickon had to be pulled back and he fought and then didn't because the gray wolf sat on his foot and gave him a look. Ed ran with the rope, breath hard in his chest. Below, on the plain, a line moved like ants in thawed sugar. It was not the dead. It was men. Hundreds, then more. Then a flow from the trees that went on with the monotony of living. They came with poles over their shoulders and children on their hips and bundles on their backs and eyes that looked ahead at the gate and did not look down where whatever lay at their feet couldn't hurt worse than what had happened already. They carried brooms and axes and pots and the slings men hang babies in when the road must be walked. They carried a flayed man banner torn and trampled and used as a blanket. They carried a banner with a direwolf on gray, and it was poor and roughly stitched, and theirs. Tormund knocked an arrow reflexively and then laughed and took it off the string. "Looks like somebody else learned a trick from your letters," he said. "That or your letters had babies." The first of the men to reach the gate looked up with a face burnt by cold and wind, and the things men do to one another when winter makes them. He cupped his hands and shouted, and the echo came up in a ragged chorus behind him. "Open! Who are you?" Yarwick boomed, because form satisfied something deep even when it wasn't needed. "Men who don't want to die for a flayed man," the fellow shouted. "Men whose lord died and then wounded and then died again. Men whose boys went to a war 5 years ago and didn't come back. Men who have axes to grind and would rather grind them on dead things than on one another." He lifted something above his head, and it flashed red in the last of the light, and Jon saw it was a child's toy, a carved wolf with a tail that had broken off and been glued back. Jon looked at Ygritte. She nodded once and tipped her chin toward the gate in the tunnel like a captain sending a ship out of harbor. He lifted his hand. The horn blew once. The gate moved. A slow, hard song of wood and iron and men. The people poured in, and in the press there were Manderley men and mountain men and men who bore no names but the ones their lovers used for them. There were women who had cut the hair on one side of their heads because it was easier to keep clean that way, and men who had done the same for the same reason. There were children who screamed with relief and then fell asleep. "Should we swear them?" Bowen Marsh asked, dry-lipped. He had found something like a dry island inside his own doubt since the night with the knives. "Not to us," Jon said. "To the living, to the line." He made them swear on a bowl of water that had not yet frozen and a handful of earth that had thawed for an hour and a piece of iron. He made the words simple so that men could remember them and tell them to their sons without a priest. He said, "I will stand. I will keep my hands from harming the living when the dead come. I will listen. I will turn strange men into neighbors because neighbors are harder to kill. I will not go south while the north needs me." And then he let them drink and eat and sleep. Ygritte watched him with an expression that was not pride and not happiness and not any single thing he could name. "You made a new vow," she said that night, by the low fire in his room. "The old vows are wearing through. You stitched a patch. The old vows kept us from taking wives," Jon said. "They didn't keep us from loving. They kept us from owning land. They didn't keep us from building walls. They kept us from crowns. They didn't keep us from leaders. Patches last through a season. Sometimes they last longer. Sometimes," she said, "sometimes a patch becomes the only honest part that's left." She slid down onto the floor and lay with her head on his knee. Ghost huffed and laid his wolf's head on her ankle, and the weight of them grounded Jon in a way no vow ever had. When he slept that night, he dreamed of a woman with a sword of light in a city of bells, and he dreamed of a boy on a throne that was no throne at all but a chair in front of a fire, and he dreamed of a sea that let men walk with ropes knotted from others' hands. In the morning, he did not tell anyone his dreams. He rose and counted barrels and then made a plan to place oil on the ice in long lines that could be lit by one torch and burn across the plain in a net. He asked Yarwick to start the work, and Yarwick grumbled and did, and kissed his teeth at a clever joint he had thought of in the night. He asked Ed to ration salt, and Ed made a joke about being promoted from air to salt and did it well. He asked Tormund to guard the line, and Tormund snarled at the duty and then took it like a treat. He asked Ygritte to train another dozen boys, and she rolled her eyes and told him to keep his nose out of her class and then made better archers out of 13. And when the dead came again 2 weeks later, under a sky so clear the stars looked like holes in the dome of night, they came up against lines of fire that ran like threads across the field and didn't cross. They met a defense that had learned their steps and would not let them dance. They sent one of the white ones forward, who lifted a hand, and the fire faltered and then rose again because Melisandre stood 10 paces behind Jon and said, once, in a voice that had forgotten kings and remembered only flame, "No," and the fire obeyed in the only way fire ever does. It burned. After men slept and dreamt of food. Shireen made Jane laugh by pretending to be a queen and failing and then being herself and winning. Rickon took 3 boys his age to the top of the wall and threw snowballs at his future because it came within range. Davos drew a map of Skagos for those who would never go and told them about a white rabbit that had led him to a cave when he was sure he would die. And the rabbit had turned out to be a man in a rabbit mask, because the island was like that. Tormund insulted Mance and Mance insulted Tormund, and the insults built a bridge men walked on to cross from their fear to their laughter. Jon stood at the top of the wall again with Ygritte, because that was where they went to say true things. The world shone below them with treachery and invitation both. The cold bit, the light blessed. We will have years of this, Ygritte said. Fighting, making a world, fighting again, maybe dying. If we don't, it'll be because we did something very clever and very stupid both. We'll do both, Jon said. Often. She leaned into him. Good, I like doing both. Keeps me from getting bored. She looked down at the iron twist on her wrist and then up, and her eyes were bright. You stole me and I stole you back. We'll steal a world if we have to. We will, Jon said. He believed it. He had learned to believe in small, thick ways that lasted. Ghost stretched and yawned and then lifted his head and looked north with that deep attention wolves give. And Jon followed his gaze and saw only trees and snow and faint blue air. He didn't mind not seeing. Seeing was for men with time. He had work and love, and a patchworked vow, and fires to light and quench, and a world to hold in a winter that had not done with them. He took Ygritte's hand and they went down and they did the next thing, and then the next, and then the next again, because that's what the living do until the living is done.